Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Wiley Brackett had been driving the Dalton Highway for 11 years, and he thought he knew every mile of that frozen ribbon of asphalt. The highway stretched from Fairbanks north to Prudhoe Bay, cutting through some of the most desolate territory in North America. Most people saw it as a dangerous route, a place where trucks broke down and drivers froze to death if they made a single mistake. But Wiley saw it differently. To him, the Dalton was freedom. Out here there were no traffic jams, no angry dispatchers breathing down his neck, no complicated delivery schedules that changed every hour. Just him, his truck, and the endless white landscape that stretched in all directions. The morning had started like any other. Wiley left Fairbanks before dawn with a load of industrial equipment bound for Deadhorse. The sky was that strange purple-gray color that passed for daylight in late November, and the temperature gauge on his dashboard read -32. Cold enough that diesel fuel turned to gel if you didn't keep the engine running, cold enough that exposed skin would freeze in under 2 minutes. Wiley had dressed in layers: thermal underwear, flannel shirt, insulated coveralls, and a parka that made him look twice his actual size. He'd learned early on that fashion meant nothing up here. Survival was the only currency that mattered. His dispatcher, Thora Keene, had radioed him just after he passed mile marker 50. Her voice crackled through the static, professional and distant as always. Thora had been dispatching for Arctic freight companies for 20 years, and she developed the emotional range of a robot. Nothing fazed her. Blizzards, breakdowns, drivers who went missing for days, she handled it all with the same calm, measured tone. "Brackett, this is base. Weather Service is calling for ice fog starting around noon. You might want to find a pullout if visibility drops." Wiley keyed his mic. "Copy that. I'll keep an eye on it." He appreciated the heads up, even though he'd been watching the sky himself. The clouds were building in a way that promised trouble. Ice fog was one of the Dalton's more dangerous features. It happened when the temperature dropped so low that moisture in the air froze instantly, creating a dense white mist that could reduce visibility to zero. Drivers had been known to pull over and wait for hours, sometimes days, until it cleared. Some never made it. Every year, search and rescue teams found trucks that had slid off the road into ravines or collided with obstacles the drivers never saw coming. The Dalton didn't forgive mistakes, and ice fog turned every mistake into a potential death sentence. Wiley kept his speed steady at 45 miles per hour, his eyes scanning the road ahead. The highway was mostly empty this time of year. The big summer convoys that hauled equipment to the oil fields had finished months ago, and now only the hardcore drivers made the run. Wiley preferred it this way. Fewer trucks meant fewer idiots doing stupid things, and it meant the silence was deeper, more complete. He could go hours without seeing another vehicle, and that suited him just fine. People had become complicated for him. After his divorce 8 years ago, he'd found that the only relationships he could maintain were the ones conducted through a radio, where emotions stayed simple and expectations stayed low. The ice fog hit around 11:30, earlier than predicted. One moment, Wiley could see a quarter mile ahead, and the next he was driving through a white wall that pressed against his windshield like something alive. He eased off the accelerator, bringing his speed down to 20, then 15. His headlights reflected back at him, turning the fog into a blinding curtain. He switched to his fog lights, which helped marginally, but mostly he was navigating by feel, keeping the truck centered by watching the subtle change in snow texture that marked the road's edge. He'd been creeping forward for about 10 minutes when his CB radio crackled to life. But instead of Thora's voice or another driver checking in, what came through was something else entirely. It was a distress call, but the voice was broken up, layered with static and strange echoes that made it hard to understand. Assistance required. Pump Station 7, equipment failure. The voice cut out, replaced by a high-pitched whine that made Wiley wince. He grabbed his mic. "This is Brackett on Channel 19. I'm picking up a distress call but can't make out the details. Who's calling and what's your location?" The response came back, but it was worse than before. The voice sounded like it was underwater, or maybe speaking through several layers of glass. Words overlapped themselves, creating an unsettling echo effect. Pump Station 7, Dalton Mile, 184, need. Static consumed the rest. Wiley checked his GPS. Mile marker 184 was about 30 miles ahead, right in the heart of the ice fog. Pump Station 7 was one of the old decommissioned sites, shut down years ago when the oil companies consolidated operations. He'd passed it 100 times and never seen any activity there. The place had been abandoned since before he started driving this route. He keyed his mic again. "Repeat your message. Pump Station 7 has been closed for years. Are you sure that's your location?" This time, the response was clearer, though still distorted by that strange echo. "Station 7, yes. Emergency. Please respond." Then the voice said something that made Wiley's blood run cold. The voice said his name. "Brackett, need assistance. Hurry." How did whoever was calling know his name? He hadn't identified himself beyond his handle. He tried calling back, but now he got nothing but static, and that persistent whine that seemed to pulse with an almost rhythmic quality. Wiley sat there in his cab, the engine rumbling beneath him, the ice fog pressing against the windows like it wanted to get in. Every instinct told him to ignore the call and keep moving. Decommissioned pump stations didn't have working radios. Voices on the CB didn't echo like that unless there was serious equipment malfunction. And nobody should have known his name. But there was another part of him, the part that had been driving these roads for over a decade, that couldn't ignore a distress call. Up here, ignoring someone in trouble was the same as killing them. The cold didn't care about your reasons or your suspicions. It just killed, efficiently and without mercy. He made his decision. He'd head to mile marker 184 and check it out. If it turned out to be nothing, he'd just lost an hour. If someone really was in trouble, he might save a life. He eased his truck forward, watching his odometer count off the miles. The ice fog seemed to thicken the further north he went, until he was navigating almost blind, trusting the feel of the road beneath his tires and the faint changes in the white wall around him. Twice, he had to stop completely when the visibility dropped to nothing, sitting with his engine running, burning fuel he might need later, waiting for a brief clearing that let him creep forward another few hundred yards. Mile marker 184 finally appeared out of the fog like a ghost. The sign was old and weathered, barely legible, but it was there. Wiley started looking for the turnoff to Pump Station 7. He remembered it as being about half a mile past the marker, a narrow access road that led east into what had once been a small service complex. When he found the turn, he hesitated. The access road was covered in snow and showed no recent tire tracks. If someone was really out here calling for help, how had they arrived? There were no vehicles visible, no footprints, nothing to suggest human presence. He turned onto the access road anyway, his truck crawling forward in first gear. The road climbed slightly, and as he reached the top of a small rise, the pump station came into view, or rather what was left of it. The main building was still standing, but just barely. The metal siding was rusted and torn, hanging in strips that rattled in the wind. Several windows were broken, and snow had drifted through the openings. There were 3 smaller structures that looked like they might have been storage units or worker quarters, all in similar states of decay. The whole complex had the look of a place that had been forgotten by time, left to rot in the Arctic wind. Wiley parked his truck about 50 yards from the main building and sat there, engine running, studying the scene. The ice fog had thinned slightly at this elevation, giving him better visibility. He could see that the gate to the compound had been torn off its hinges years ago. A rusted sign that once warned of restricted access lay face down in the snow. Everything about the place screamed abandonment. Nothing moved except the wind-driven snow and those strips of metal siding that banged against the building with irregular rhythm. He grabbed his CB mic and tried calling again. "This is Brackett. I'm at Pump Station 7. If anyone's here, respond." The answer that came back made his skin crawl. It was his own voice. Not someone impersonating him, but his actual voice, speaking words he hadn't said. "At Pump Station 7. If anyone's here, respond." The message played back with a delay of about 2 seconds, like an echo, but it was too perfect, too clear to be a natural echo. It was as if someone had recorded his transmission and was playing it back to him. He tried again, speaking slowly. "This is Wiley Brackett. Who am I talking to?" Again, his own voice came back. "Wiley Brackett. Who am I talking to?" But this time, there was something underneath it. A whisper that said something else, something he couldn't quite make out. He turned off the CB radio. Whatever was happening with the transmission, it wasn't natural. Equipment malfunction could explain some weird radio behavior, but not this. Not his own voice being played back with that unsettling precision. He sat in his truck, watching the abandoned pump station, trying to decide what to do. The smart move was to leave, get back on the highway, and report the weird radio transmission to Thora. Let someone else figure out what was going on out here. But he'd come all this way, and there was still a chance, however small, that someone was actually in trouble. Wiley shut down his engine, immediately feeling the cold begin to seep into the cab. He'd give himself 20 minutes to check the main building, then get back to the truck before the cold became dangerous. He pulled on his parka, wrapped a scarf around his face, and grabbed his flashlight. The wind hit him like a physical blow when he opened the door, and he had to force himself to step down into the knee-deep snow. The temperature felt even colder here, if that was possible, and his breath formed instant clouds of ice crystals that hung in the air. The walk to the main building took longer than he expected. The snow was deeper than it looked, and several times he broke through crusty layers and sank up to his thighs. By the time he reached the entrance, his legs were burning from the effort and his lungs ached from breathing the frozen air. The door hung half open, blocked by a drift of snow. He kicked it clear and pushed inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The interior was worse than the exterior. The roof had collapsed in sections, leaving piles of snow and debris on the floor. Equipment that had once been valuable enough to justify this isolated outpost now stood rusted and broken, covered in ice. Pipes had burst and frozen, creating strange ice formations that looked like sculptures. Wiley moved through the building slowly, his flashlight beam searching every corner. The place had clearly been empty for years. There were no signs of recent habitation, no footprints in the snow that had blown in through broken windows. No trash or supplies that would indicate someone camping out here. He found what looked like it had been the radio room. The equipment was ancient, probably from the 70s or 80s, all of it long dead and frozen. There was no way this gear had transmitted the distress call he'd heard. He was about to leave when he noticed something odd. On the wall behind the old radio equipment was a series of marks. At first, he thought they were just random scratches in the paint, but as he looked closer, he realized they were words. Someone had carved messages into the wall, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. He moved his flashlight beam across the surface, reading what he could make out. "Day 43, still waiting," said one. "They promised pickup. Nobody came," said another. The dates on some of the messages went back years, but others looked more recent. One message, carved deep enough that it stood out from the others, said simply, "Don't trust the radio. It lies." Wiley felt his pulse quicken. He moved along the wall, reading more messages. They told a disturbing story of someone who had been stationed here, waiting for relief that never came. The tone of the messages grew increasingly desperate and paranoid. "Hearing voices on the radio, my own voice, makes no sense," one said. Another proclaimed, "Not alone here, something in the fog, watches through the windows." The final message, carved so deep the metal beneath the paint showed through, simply said, "They're coming. Hide the logs. Tell no one. Ivar Lyle." Ivar Lyle. The name meant nothing to Wiley, but clearly this person had been the last one here, or at least the one who'd left these messages. He scanned his flashlight around the room, looking for the logs Lyle had mentioned. He found them in a metal cabinet that had been wedged behind a collapsed section of ceiling. The cabinet was locked, but the cold had made the metal brittle, and he was able to pry it open with a piece of broken pipe. Inside were 3 notebooks, their pages yellowed and water-stained but still legible. Wiley opened the first notebook. The entries were dated, starting from 12 years ago. They documented the daily operations of Pump Station 7 back when it was still active. Weather reports, equipment maintenance, supply deliveries. Nothing unusual. But about halfway through the first notebook, the tone changed. November 15th, radio acting strange, picking up transmissions that don't make sense. Voices that sound familiar but wrong somehow. The entry went on to describe exactly what Wiley had experienced. Messages that echoed back, voices that sounded like recordings, and the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the communications equipment. The second notebook was worse. The entries became erratic, sometimes multiple per day, sometimes with weeks between them. Ivar Lyle described being unable to reach his dispatcher, hearing distress calls that led nowhere, and seeing lights in the ice fog that moved in ways that defied explanation. December 3rd, saw the convoy lights again, 3 trucks in formation. But when I went outside, nothing there. Checked the logs. No convoy scheduled for this route. Where are they coming from? Another entry, dated 2 days later. Radios are playing back my transmissions. Exact words, exact timing. Feels like I'm talking to myself across time. Wiley turned to the last notebook with hands that were starting to shake from more than just the cold. This notebook was different. The handwriting was erratic, sometimes barely legible, and the entries made less and less sense. But one entry stopped him cold. It was dated tomorrow, November 22nd. Today was November 21st. The entry read, "Brackett arrives, responds to the call, finds the logs. Don't know if this helps or makes it worse. Pattern repeats, always repeats. We're all stuck in the same loop." He stared at the page, his mind refusing to accept what he was seeing. This was impossible. Nobody could write an entry for tomorrow, especially not 12 years ago. He checked the other notebooks again, confirming the dates. They started 12 years ago and ended tomorrow. The final entry, written in a shaky hand that suggested desperation or fear, simply said, "If you're reading this, you're part of it now. The fog takes time and twists it. The radio is the anchor. Destroy it or escape. Don't stay after dark. They come when the light fails." Wiley looked at his watch. It was 3:15 in the afternoon. In November, this far north, full darkness came by 4:30. He had a little over an hour to get back to his truck and get out of here. He grabbed all 3 notebooks, stuffing them inside his parka, and headed for the door. But as he stepped back outside, he froze. The ice fog had thickened again, dropping visibility to almost nothing. And through that white curtain he could see lights. 3 sets of headlights moving in formation, coming up the access road toward the pump station. A convoy, just like Ivar Lyle had described in his logs. 3 trucks, their lights cutting through the fog, moving with the steady determination of drivers who knew exactly where they were going. Wiley stood there, watching them approach, part of him wanting to wave them down, to confirm they were real, to break this growing sense of unreality that had gripped him since he'd read those notebooks. But another part, the part that had read Lyle's increasingly frantic entries, told him to hide. He ducked back inside the pump station and moved to a window where he could watch without being seen. The convoy reached the compound and stopped, the trucks forming a loose circle around the main building. Their engines kept running, exhaust visible even in the fog. But nobody got out. The trucks just sat there, lights on, engines rumbling, as if waiting for something. Wiley watched them for several minutes, but nothing changed. No doors opened. No drivers emerged. Nothing moved except the wind-driven snow. Then his CB radio crackled to life. He'd left it in the truck, which meant he shouldn't be able to hear it from inside this building. But he heard it clearly, the sound cutting through the wind and the walls as if distance meant nothing. And the voice that came through wasn't Thora's or another driver's. It was his own voice, speaking words he'd never said. "They're here. The convoy. Don't go outside. They're not what they seem." Wiley pressed himself against the cold wall of the pump station, his breath coming in short bursts that created small clouds in the frozen air. The 3 trucks outside remained motionless, their headlights boring through the ice fog like searchlights. He couldn't see the drivers through the windshields, couldn't see any movement at all. But he knew with absolute certainty that whatever was in those trucks was aware of his presence. The way they'd positioned themselves, forming that loose circle around the building, felt deliberate, calculated, like they were boxing him in. His own voice continued to crackle from his truck's CB radio, the words distorted and layered with that same unsettling echo he'd heard earlier. The message kept repeating, a warning loop that seemed to fold back on itself. He tried to make sense of it, tried to find a rational explanation for how his voice could be broadcasting words he'd never spoken, but his mind kept circling back to those notebooks in his parka. Ivar Lyle had described the same phenomenon 12 years ago, right before everything at Pump Station 7 fell apart. Right before Lyle had carved that final, desperate message into the wall and disappeared. Wiley forced himself to think like a trucker, not like a scared man trapped in an abandoned building. He had assets. His truck was still running, which meant he had heat and power. He had fuel in his tanks, enough to run for hours if needed. He had food and water in his sleeper berth. Most importantly, he had mobility. These ghost trucks or whatever they were might be blocking the access road, but the Dalton Highway was only half a mile away. If he could get to his truck and make a run for it, he might be able to punch through their formation or go around them through the snow. The problem was the distance between the pump station and his truck. 50 yards across open ground, in ice fog thick enough to hide anything, with those headlights sweeping the area, and the cold. He'd already been outside longer than was safe, and his fingers were starting to go numb despite his gloves. If he made a run for it and didn't make it to his truck, the exposure would kill him in minutes. But staying here wasn't an option either. The sun was dropping fast, and according to Lyle's logs, whatever happened at this place got worse after dark. He checked his watch. 3:40. Less than an hour of twilight left. He needed to move now. Wiley crept to the back of the pump station, away from where the trucks were positioned. There was a service door that opened onto what had once been a loading area. The door was frozen shut, but he put his shoulder into it and felt it give slightly. 3 more hard shoves, and it popped open with a crack that sounded impossibly loud in the stillness. He froze, listening for any response from the trucks. Their engines continued their steady rumble, unchanged. No doors opened. No footsteps crunched through snow. The loading area gave him some cover from the headlights. He could see his truck from here, a dark shape barely visible through the fog. The distance looked much longer than 50 yards now. It looked like a mile. He took a deep breath of air so cold it burned his lungs, then started moving. Not running, which would have been suicide in the deep snow, but a fast, steady walk that ate up ground while conserving energy. He kept his eyes on his truck, using it as a beacon, trying not to think about what might be watching him from those other vehicles. He was halfway to his truck when he heard the sound. It started low, almost below the threshold of hearing, then built into a deep mechanical groan that seemed to come from all three trucks at once. Their engines were revving, synchronized in a way that no human coordination could achieve. The sound built and built until Wiley could feel it in his chest, vibrating through the frozen air like a physical force. Then, simultaneously, all three trucks began to move. Not toward him, but away. They were backing up, repositioning themselves, and as they moved, their headlights swept across the compound in coordinated arcs. Wiley dropped flat in the snow as one of those light beams passed over where he'd been standing. The cold bit into him immediately, seeping through his coveralls, but he didn't move. He watched the trucks complete their maneuver, and what he saw made his blood run colder than the Arctic wind. They weren't just repositioning randomly. They were forming a new pattern, and the pattern was centered on his truck. They were cutting off his escape route. He had seconds to decide, stay hidden in the snow and freeze, or make a final desperate run for his truck. The third option, the one his rational mind kept screaming at him to take, was to retreat to the pump station and wait for rescue. But rescue might not come for days, and something told him that whatever was happening here wouldn't wait that long. The trucks were hurting him, playing with him, and he had the sick feeling that if he let them finish their game, he wouldn't survive to see morning. Wiley pushed himself up and ran. Not the careful walk from before, but an all-out sprint that had him floundering through snowdrifts and nearly falling twice. The trucks responded immediately. Their engines roared and they surged forward, headlights swinging to track his movement. But they were still 50 yards away, and he only had 20 left to go. He could hear his own ragged breathing, could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, could taste blood in his mouth from the frozen air shredding his throat. 10 yards. 5. His hand closed on the door handle of his truck and yanked it open. He threw himself into the cab and slammed the door, hitting the lock button with a hand that shook so badly he almost missed. The familiar interior of his truck felt like sanctuary. He gunned the engine and threw the transmission into reverse, not caring about the careful maneuvering he usually employed. The truck lurched backward, tires spinning in the snow, and he cranked the wheel hard to bring the nose around. In his mirrors he could see the three trucks closing in, moving faster than any semi should be able to move through deep snow. They weren't obeying normal physics, weren't limited by traction or weight distribution. They just came, relentless and impossible. Wiley got his truck facing the access road and floored the accelerator. His engine roared, turbochargers screaming, and the truck leaped forward. The three pursuing vehicles were right behind him now, so close he could see them clearly in his mirrors despite the fog. And what he saw confirmed his worst fears. The windshields were empty. No drivers, no movement inside the cabs at all. Just empty seats and dark interiors, trucks driving themselves with mechanical precision. The access road was a narrow track through the snow, barely wide enough for one truck, and Wiley pushed his vehicle to speeds that were suicidal in these conditions. His truck, fishtailed on patches of ice, bounced over frozen ruts, threatened to slide off into the drifts on either side. But he kept his foot down. kept fighting the wheel, because the alternative was letting those things behind him catch up. He could hear them now even over his own engine, their transmissions grinding through gears, their air brakes hissing. They sounded wrong, like recordings of truck sounds played through speakers that couldn't quite capture the bass frequencies. The main highway appeared ahead through the fog, and Wiley felt a surge of hope. If he could make it to the Dalton, he could open up and outrun them. His truck was newer, better maintained, and he was a damn good driver. He'd driven this highway in conditions that would make other truckers weep. He could do this. The access road began its slight descent toward the highway junction, and Wiley used gravity to add a few more miles per hour to his speed. Behind him, the 3 trucks matched his acceleration effortlessly. He hit the junction doing 45, way too fast, and felt his trailer begin to swing out. For a horrible moment, he thought he was going to jackknife, could picture the whole rig folding sideways and spilling across both lanes. But his hands worked the wheel with the muscle memory of 11 years on ice, and he brought the trailer back in line. The truck straightened out on the highway and he pushed harder, getting up to 50, then 55. The 3 trucks behind him fell back slightly, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Wiley thought he might actually escape. That was when his CB radio crackled to life again. This time, it wasn't his voice. It was Thora Keene. But something was wrong with her voice too, that same underwater quality, that same layering of echoes. "Brackett, this is base. You need to stop. Pull over and wait for assistance." He grabbed his mic without thinking, the habit of responding to dispatch too ingrained to resist. "Thora, I'm in trouble. 3 trucks are following me," and he stopped, realizing what he'd just done. He'd confirmed his location, confirmed he was listening. The voice that came back wasn't Thora's anymore. It shifted mid-sentence, cycling through different voices he recognized. First Thora, then other truckers he'd talked to over the years, then people from his past. His ex-wife. His father who'd died 5 years ago. Each voice spoke the same words. "Stop the truck, Wiley. Pull over. You can't escape. The fog has you now." The voices overlapped, creating a chorus that was both familiar and profoundly wrong. He ripped the CB microphone cord from its socket, cutting off the transmission, but the voices continued. They were coming from his own radio now, even though it was no longer receiving. Wiley focused on driving, blocking out the impossible voices, watching his mirrors for the 3 trucks. They'd fallen back to about a quarter mile, maintaining that distance but not closing it. Almost like they were herding him rather than chasing him. The thought sent a new spike of fear through him. Where were they herding him to? He checked his GPS, confirming his position. Mile marker 207, heading south toward Fairbanks. Normal traffic should start appearing soon. Other trucks, supply vehicles heading north, maybe a state trooper. Once he had witnesses, once other people saw what was happening, this would have to stop. Whatever reality-bending nightmare he'd stumbled into, it couldn't sustain itself with witnesses. But the highway remained empty. He drove for 10 miles, then 15, and saw nothing. No other vehicles, no tracks in the snow, no signs of human presence at all. The ice fog thinned and thickened in waves, but it never fully cleared. And those 3 trucks stayed behind him, matching his speed, their empty cabs visible whenever he got a clear view in his mirrors. They looked like his truck, he realized. Not the same model or color, but the same general configuration. Freightliner cabs with box trailers, standard Arctic freight configurations. They looked like him. The voices on his CB had settled into a new pattern. They were speaking in unison now, all the different voices synchronized, and they were reading something. It took him a moment to recognize what. They were reading from Ivar Lyle's notebooks, the entries he'd stuffed in his parka. The voice recited, November 15th, radio acting strange, picking up transmissions that don't make sense. The exact words Wiley had read less than an hour ago. But he was the only one who'd read those notebooks. They'd been locked in that cabinet for 12 years. How could the voices know what was written in them? Unless they'd been through this before. Unless every word in those notebooks was a recording of previous incidents, previous drivers who'd responded to that distress call and ended up trapped in the same loop. The entry dated tomorrow suddenly made horrible sense. It wasn't prediction. It was history. Wiley had already done all of this, was always going to do all of this, and the notebooks were just documentation of an event that existed outside normal time. He was reading his own future because his future had already happened, was happening now, would happen again in an endless cycle. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he nearly lost control of his truck. His hands shook on the wheel, and he had to consciously force himself to breathe, to stay focused, to keep driving. If what he was thinking was true, then there was no escape. The fog, the trucks, the radio voices, they were all part of a temporal loop centered on Pump Station 7. Ivar Lyle had gotten caught in it 12 years ago. Other drivers before Lyle had probably gotten caught too. And now it was Wiley's turn. He was going to drive these roads forever, chasing his own ghost, responding to his own distress calls, creating the very haunting that had drawn him here. No. He rejected that thought with every ounce of stubbornness he possessed. He'd driven the Dalton for 11 years, had survived storms that killed better men, had kept his rig running in conditions that turned diesel to jelly and metal to glass. He wasn't going to surrender to some temporal anomaly, or whatever the hell this was. There had to be a way out. Lyle's final message said destroy the radio or escape. He tried escape and it wasn't working. That left destruction. Wiley looked at his CB radio, still broadcasting those synchronized voices even though it was disconnected from its power source. The voices were reading further into the notebooks now, getting closer to the final entries, the ones that documented Lyle's descent into paranoia and fear. Wiley made his decision. He grabbed the radio unit with both hands and ripped it from its mounting bracket. Wires tore free and sparks flew, but the voices didn't stop. If anything, they got louder. He lowered his window, feeling the brutal cold blast in, and threw the radio out onto the highway. It bounced once, twice, then shattered against the asphalt. The 3 trucks behind him suddenly accelerated. They closed the distance in seconds, moving faster than any truck should be able to move, and Wiley saw them clearly in his mirrors for the first time. They weren't just empty. They were wrong. The cabs were the right shape, but the proportions were off, stretched slightly, distorted. The headlights were too bright, almost burning through the fog with an intensity that hurt to look at. And on the grills, where company logos should be, there was nothing. Blank metal that reflected no light. They were coming to ram him. He could see it in the way they were positioning themselves, one on each side and one directly behind. They were going to box him in and crush him or force him off the road, or both. Wiley's mind raced through options. He couldn't outrun them. He couldn't fight them. But maybe he could outthink them. The fog, Lyle had written, takes time and twists it. The radio is the anchor. He'd destroyed his radio, but that hadn't stopped anything. Because the radio wasn't the only anchor. The notebooks were anchors too. Physical objects that connected the present to the past, that maintained the loop. Wiley yanked the 3 notebooks from his parka and threw them out of the window. They tumbled through the air and landed in the snow beside the highway. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The 3 trucks behind him flickered, like bad television reception. their solid forms breaking up into static and reforming. The ice fog around him began to swirl and twist, forming patterns that hurt his eyes to look at. And from somewhere very far away, or maybe very close, he heard a sound like a radio changing stations, cycling through frequencies, searching for a signal that no longer existed. The world lurched sideways. Wiley's truck was suddenly moving through clear air under a gray sky. The ice fog was gone. The 3 trucks were gone. He was alone on the Dalton Highway with normal visibility and a normal landscape. He slammed on his brakes, bringing his truck to a shuddering stop on the shoulder. He sat there, engine idling, hands still gripping the wheel, trying to process what had just happened. His CB radio was still gone, ripped from its mount, wires hanging loose. But when he checked his mirrors, he could see real traffic approaching from the north. A tanker truck, perfectly ordinary, with a human driver visible in the cab. The tanker rolled past and the driver gave him a friendly wave. Wiley waved back automatically, his mind still reeling. He checked his GPS, mile marker 215. He'd lost about 8 miles. Or gained them, he couldn't tell which. The clock on his dashboard said 4:20, which meant he'd lost about an hour. Or had he? His watch said 5:30. Different devices showing different times. More evidence of temporal distortion, or just the normal confusion of a man who'd been through hell. His sat phone was where he'd left it, clipped to his sun visor. It had a signal now, strong and clear. He called Thora Keene, and this time when she answered, her voice was normal, professional and distant as always. No eerie echoes, no underwater distortion. "Brackett, you missed your check-in at 2:40. Where are you?" He started to explain, then stopped. What could he possibly say that would make sense? That he'd found an abandoned pump station with notebooks that predicted the future? That ghost trucks had chased him through an ice fog that didn't follow normal physics? She'd think he'd had a breakdown, would ground him pending psychiatric evaluation. "Equipment trouble," he said finally. "Lost time dealing with it. I'm back en route now. Should make Deadhorse by midnight." Thora accepted this without question. Equipment trouble was common enough on the Dalton. She logged his position and told him to check in again at mile marker 300. He promised he would and ended the call. For several minutes he just sat there, watching normal traffic pass by, trying to convince himself that what he'd experienced was real and not some hypothermia-induced hallucination. But he knew it was real. The missing CB radio proved it. The missing hour on his watch proved it. And somewhere back at mile marker 184, in a decommissioned pump station, 3 notebooks sat in a locked cabinet, documenting his experience along with all the others who'd fallen into that temporal loop. Wiley wondered how many drivers had responded to that distress call over the years, how many had made it out, and how many were still trapped, driving endless loops through ice fog, chasing echoes of themselves. He put his truck in gear and started moving again, rejoining the flow of southbound traffic. As he drove, he made a decision. He'd finish this run, deliver his load, then take a few weeks off. Get his head straight. Maybe talk to other drivers who'd run this route for a long time. See if anyone else had stories about Pump Station 7. And he'd never, ever respond to an anonymous distress call again. The Dalton demanded a certain code of behavior from its drivers, a willingness to help each other survive its harsh conditions. But some calls weren't meant to be answered. Some cries for help came from places where help was impossible, where the very act of trying to save someone trapped you in their fate. Mile marker 215 became 220, then 230. Normal traffic continued to flow around him. The sky began its long fade toward darkness. Everything was ordinary again, routine, exactly as it should be. But Wiley couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left something behind at that pump station. some part of himself that was still there, still reading those notebooks, still trying to make sense of impossible temporal loops. He wondered if that's what had happened to Ivar Lyle. If some version of Lyle was still out there, trapped in the fog, while another version had escaped to carve warnings on walls. The question that haunted him most was simple and terrible. Had he really escaped? Or was this just another layer of the loop, another iteration where he thought he'd gotten free, only to find himself back at mile marker 184 when the pattern reset? There was no way to know, no test he could run to prove he'd returned to baseline reality. He just had to trust that throwing those notebooks out the window had broken the cycle, had severed the connection between past and present that kept the loop running. But deep down, in a place he didn't want to examine too closely, Wiley suspected the loop wasn't really broken. It was just waiting for the next driver to hear that distress call, waiting for the next curious trucker to ignore his instincts and turn down that access road, waiting to add another set of entries to those notebooks, another voice to the chorus that echoed through the impossible radio transmissions. The Dalton Highway was a road that didn't forgive mistakes, and responding to that call had been the biggest mistake of Wiley's career. He drove on through the gathering darkness, his headlights carving a path through the normal, natural night. Behind him, somewhere in the ice fog that rolled eternal across the Arctic landscape, Pump Station 7 stood abandoned and waiting, and in a locked metal cabinet, 3 notebooks documented horrors that existed outside of time, warning anyone who found them that some mysteries were better left unsolved, some calls better left unanswered. Wiley made it to Dead Horse by 1 a.m, 3 hours later than scheduled, but still within acceptable limits given the equipment trouble he'd reported. The northern terminus of the Dalton Highway was a collection of industrial buildings and worker camps that served the Prudhoe Bay oil fields, a place where human presence felt temporary and grudging, as if the Arctic merely tolerated the intrusion. He dropped his trailer at the designated yard, went through the paperwork with the night supervisor, and found a parking spot near the truck stop where he could grab a few hours of sleep before heading back south. Sleep didn't come. He lay in his sleeper berth, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl around his truck. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those 3 trucks with their empty cabs, saw the notebooks with their impossible dates, heard his own voice echoing back at him through the radio. The rational part of his mind kept trying to find explanations. Mass hallucination brought on by carbon monoxide poisoning, hypothermia-induced confusion, some kind of elaborate prank by bored oil field workers. But none of those explanations fit the evidence. His CB radio was genuinely missing, ripped from its mount with his own hands. An hour of time had disappeared from his watch, and he remembered every detail with a clarity that hallucinations never possessed. Around 3 a.m, he gave up on sleep and climbed out of his berth. The truck stop was nearly empty at this hour, just a handful of other drivers scattered across the parking lot. Inside, the fluorescent lights were harsh after the darkness, and the coffee tasted like it had been sitting on the burner for 6 hours. Wiley took his cup to a booth in the corner and pulled out his sat phone. He needed to know if other drivers had experienced anything similar. He needed to know if Pump Station 7 had a history. He started with online trucker forums, scrolling through years of posts about the Dalton Highway. Most of it was routine: weather warnings, road condition updates, complaints about this stretch or that facility. But buried deep in threads from 8 years ago, he found something. A driver named Orson Vale had posted about hearing strange radio transmissions near mile marker 184. Vale described voices that echoed, distress calls that led nowhere, and a feeling of being watched while driving through heavy fog. The thread had gotten a few responses, mostly other drivers dismissing it as tiredness or equipment malfunction. Vale had posted a few follow-up comments, increasingly frustrated that no one believed him, and then he'd stopped posting altogether. Wiley searched for more information about Orson Vale, but found nothing. No social media presence, no company records he could access, no indication of what had happened to the driver. It was like Vale had simply vanished after making those forum posts. Wiley felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He knew what that probably meant. Vale had gone back to investigate, had responded to another distress call, and had gotten caught in the loop permanently. Or maybe Vale had never escaped in the first place, and those forum posts were just another iteration of the pattern, another driver trying to warn others before being pulled back in. He found 2 other similar accounts buried in different forums. A driver named Ambrose Pike, who'd reported seeing convoy lights that disappeared when approached, and someone using the handle Kier, who described finding an abandoned outpost with disturbing messages carved into the walls. Neither had provided many details, and both had stopped posting shortly after their initial reports. Wiley wondered how many drivers had gone missing on the Dalton over the years, officially listed as accidents or exposure deaths, but actually victims of whatever existed at Pump Station 7. The truck stop door opened and another driver came in, stamping snow from his boots. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades on the road. He glanced around the nearly empty dining area and made his way to the counter, ordering coffee and a breakfast sandwich. Something about the way he moved, the careful economy of motion, marked him as a veteran driver. Wiley made a decision and walked over. "Long night?" Wiley asked, keeping his tone casual. The older driver looked him over, the automatic assessment that truckers made of each other, checking for signs of trouble or unstable behavior. Wiley must have passed whatever test the man was running because he nodded and gestured to the stool next to him. "Every night's long this time of year," the driver said. His voice had the gravelly quality of someone who'd smoked for years and quit. "You running south?" Wiley confirmed that he was, and they fell into the easy conversation that drivers used to pass time. Names were exchanged. The older driver introduced himself as Hale Broder, running freight for a company Wiley had heard of, and they compared routes and cargo. After a few minutes, when the preliminary trust had been established, Wiley steered the conversation toward Pump Station 7. "You ever hear anything weird about the old decommissioned sites along the Dalton?" he asked, trying to sound like he was just making conversation. "Any stories or rumors?" Hale's expression changed subtly. Not quite suspicion, but a new wariness. He took a long sip of his coffee before answering. "Why do you ask?" The question hung between them, weighted with significance. Wiley had to decide how much to reveal. If he told the whole truth, Hale would think he was crazy. But if he said nothing, he'd lose this chance to learn more. He settled on a middle ground. "I picked up some strange radio transmissions earlier today, near mile marker 184. Distress call that didn't make sense, and when I tried to respond, I got my own voice echoing back at me. Equipment malfunction probably, but it was weird enough that I wondered if it had happened to anyone else." Hale studied him for a long moment, and Wiley had the uncomfortable feeling of being evaluated. Finally, the older driver set down his coffee cup. "Pump Station 7, Hale said quietly. "That's what you're asking about, isn't it?" Wiley nodded, and Hale sighed. "I've been running this highway for 32 years. I've seen a lot of strange things, heard a lot of stories. Most of them are just that, stories. Drivers get tired, they hallucinate, they misinterpret normal events. But Pump Station 7 is different. That place has a bad reputation going back decades." Hale explained that the station had been built in the 70s during the initial Prudhoe Bay boom. It had operated normally for about 15 years, a routine service point for the pipeline system. Then, in the late 80s, there had been an incident. Details were scarce, but it involved a crew of 3 workers who'd been stationed there during a particularly brutal winter. Communications had gone down due to an ice storm, and when a relief team finally got through 2 weeks later, they found the station abandoned. No bodies, no signs of violence, just personal effects left behind and strange damage to the radio equipment. They never found those workers, Hale said. Search and rescue teams combed the area for weeks, but it was like they'd vanished into thin air. The company investigated, couldn't explain what happened, and eventually just sealed the place up. But drivers started reporting weird things after that. Radio problems, mostly. Voices that shouldn't be there. Messages that repeated, that kind of thing. And every few years someone would go investigate and either come back spooked or not come back at all. Wiley felt his chest tighten. How many drivers have gone missing? Hale shrugged. Hard to say. The Dalton's dangerous enough on its own. People die up here from weather, from accidents, from all kinds of things. But there's a pattern. Drivers who report strange experiences near Pump Station 7 tend to disappear. Either they stop showing up for runs, or they're found later with no memory of what happened, or they're just gone. The companies don't like to talk about it because it's bad for business, and most drivers who know the stories just avoid that area. Why didn't anyone warn me? Wiley asked, hearing the frustration in his own voice. Hale gave him a sad smile. Would you have believed them? If someone told you there was a haunted pump station that trapped drivers in time loops, would you have taken it seriously? He had a point. Wiley would have dismissed it as superstition or old-timer stories. He asked what Hale thought was really happening at Pump Station 7. The older driver was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I think that place exists wrong, Hale said finally. I know that sounds crazy, but it's the only way I can describe it. Something happened there, something that broke the normal rules. Time doesn't work right in that area. Space doesn't work right. And the radio equipment, for whatever reason, acts as some kind of anchor or conduit. Drivers who interact with it get caught in whatever loop or trap exists there. The smart ones realize something's wrong and get out fast. The unlucky ones get pulled in too deep and can't escape. Wiley told him about the notebooks, about finding Ivar Lyle's logs with their impossible dates. Hale's expression grew grim. Lyle. Yeah, I remember hearing about him. He was the last official worker stationed at Pump Station 7 before they shut it down completely. Decent guy, good at his job. Then he started sending increasingly weird reports back to his company, talking about radio anomalies and temporal distortions. They thought he was having a breakdown and sent a team to pull him out. But when the team got there, the station was empty and Lyle was gone. They found journals, apparently, but the company classified them. You say you found notebooks? I threw them away, Wiley admitted. They were part of what was keeping me trapped. Once I got rid of them, the loop broke and I was able to escape. Hale nodded slowly. That was smart. The physical objects seem to matter. They're like anchors tying the present to whatever happened in the past. Get rid of the anchors, break the connection. He paused, then added, But you should know, just because you got away doesn't mean you're free. That place has a way of pulling people back. Once it has your, I don't know what to call it, your temporal signature, maybe. Once it knows you exist, it can reach out and grab you again if you're not careful. The implication was clear and terrifying. Wiley asked what he should do, and Hale's answer was simple. Don't go back. Don't respond to any distress calls from that area. Don't even think about that place if you can avoid it. Some drivers who escaped reported that the loop would try to reassert itself, pulling them back through dreams or compulsive thoughts. You have to resist it. Find a different route if you can. If you can't, drive past that section as fast as safely possible and keep your CB off. They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm. Wiley felt simultaneously relieved to have confirmation that he wasn't crazy and terrified by the implications. He asked Hale if there was any way to destroy the loop permanently, to shut down whatever existed at Pump Station 7. The older driver shook his head. People have tried. A few years back, a driver named Tamsin Rourke convinced her company to let her investigate. She was smart, methodical, had a background in electrical engineering, thought she could figure out what was causing the anomalies and fix it. She went to Pump Station 7 with the whole team, equipment, the works. They spent 3 days there running tests, documenting everything. When they came back, Rourke said the place was beyond fixing. Whatever had happened there had created a permanent distortion in local space-time. The only way to stop it would be to completely demolish the site, remove every piece of material, and even then she wasn't sure it would work. The anomaly might be tied to the location itself, not just the buildings. So we just let it keep operating? Keep trapping drivers? Wiley felt anger rising alongside his fear. Hale's expression was sympathetic but resigned. What else can we do? No one believes it exists except the drivers who've experienced it, and most of them don't want to talk about it because they're afraid of being grounded for psychological issues. The companies won't do anything because officially the station is just an abandoned building. And if you go to the authorities with a story about temporal loops and ghost trucks, they'll think you're having a breakdown. We're stuck with it. Wiley wanted to argue, wanted to say there had to be something they could do, but he couldn't think of anything. Hale was right. The system wasn't designed to handle something like this. There were no protocols for dealing with locations that existed outside normal time, no agencies responsible for investigating temporal anomalies. The best they could do was warn other drivers and hope people listened. He asked Hale if there were any other locations like Pump Station 7 on the Dalton. Not that I know of, Hale said. This highway has plenty of dangers, but most of them are normal. Weather, animals, mechanical failure. Pump Station 7 is unique as far as I can tell, though I've heard stories about weird places on other routes. The Yukon has some stretches where drivers report strange things. Nunavut, up on the ice roads. Isolated places where the barriers between normal and abnormal get thin. But Pump Station 7 is the only one I know about personally. They talked for another hour, Hale sharing what he knew about the history of the Dalton and the various strange incidents that had occurred over the decades. Most were easily explained or harmless, but a few, like Pump Station 7, defied rational explanation. As dawn began to lighten the sky, Wiley felt marginally better. At least he wasn't alone in this. At least there were other drivers who knew the truth and could confirm he wasn't losing his mind. Hale gave him a sat phone number and told him to call if he experienced any more anomalies or felt the loop trying to pull him back. One more thing, Hale said as they were preparing to leave. Your dispatcher, Thora Keene, you trust her? The question surprised Wiley. Yeah, I guess. She's always been solid. Why? Hale looked uncomfortable. Some drivers think the companies know more than they're letting on. That they're aware of these anomalies but keep quiet because acknowledging them would open them up to liability. I'm not saying Thora is involved in any cover-up, but be careful what you tell her. If she reports that you're having psychological issues, you could be grounded permanently. Wiley nodded, understanding the warning. He'd already decided not to tell Thora the full story, but Hale's caution reinforced that decision. He thanked the older driver and headed back to his truck. The sun was fully up now, painting the industrial landscape in shades of gold and gray. Other drivers were starting their day, running through pre-trip inspections and warming up engines. Normal. Routine. Safe. Wiley wanted desperately to believe he was back in that normal world, that the nightmare at Pump Station 7 was behind him. But as he climbed into his cab and started his engine, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. On his dashboard, exactly where he'd kept his CB radio before ripping it out, was a small notebook. It hadn't been there when he'd parked. He was absolutely certain of that. He picked it up with trembling hands and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was his own, though he had no memory of writing anything. The entry was dated today, and it read, "Mile marker 184. Responded to distress call. Found pump station 7. The loop begins again." His hands shook as he flipped through the notebook. It was full of entries, all in his handwriting, documenting experiences he hadn't had yet, or had already had, or was currently having. The temporal confusion made his head hurt. The entries described him making repeated trips past pump station 7, each time getting pulled in a little deeper, each time finding it harder to escape. The final entry, dated a week from now, simply said, "Can't fight it anymore, going back. Maybe this time I'll understand. Maybe this time I'll find Ivar." Wiley threw the notebook out his window, watching it land in the snow beside his truck. But even as it left his hand, he knew it wouldn't matter. The loop had him now. Hale had warned him, and Lyle's logs had warned him, but he'd interacted with the anomaly, and that was enough. He was marked. Part of the pattern. And no matter how far he drove, or how long he avoided that stretch of highway, eventually he would be drawn back. The loop was patient. It had all the time in the world because at pump station 7, time wasn't a river flowing in one direction. It was a whirlpool, circular and inescapable. He sat there for a long moment, engine idling, staring at the notebook lying in the snow. Then he made a decision. He wouldn't wait for the loop to pull him back involuntarily. He'd go back on his own terms, prepared this time, armed with everything Hale had told him and everything he'd learned. Maybe he couldn't destroy the anomaly, but maybe he could understand it. Maybe he could find Ivar Lyle and the other missing drivers. Maybe he could break the pattern from the inside. It was probably a suicide mission, but it was better than spending the rest of his life waiting for the inevitable pull, wondering when the loop would claim him. Wiley put his truck in gear and headed south, back toward the Dalton Highway, back toward mile marker 184, back toward pump station 7 and whatever waited for him there. He didn't call Thora to log his departure. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. If this went wrong, if the loop took him permanently, he didn't want other drivers coming to investigate and getting caught themselves. Some sacrifices had to be made alone. Some mysteries had to be faced in silence. The highway stretched out before him, empty and white under the Arctic sky. Somewhere ahead, in a place that existed wrong, Pump Station 7 waited, and in its rusted buildings and frozen shadows, the loop continued its eternal cycle, patient and hungry, ready to welcome another driver home. The drive back to mile marker 184 took 6 hours, and every mile felt like descending into something that wasn't quite geography. Wiley kept his sat phone on, tracking his position with obsessive precision, watching as the numbers counted down toward that specific stretch of highway. The weather was clear this time. No ice fog to obscure his view, just the endless white landscape under a sky that never quite committed to being either day or night. Other traffic passed him going both directions, normal trucks with normal drivers hauling normal loads. The world around him insisted everything was fine, but Wiley knew better. He'd stopped at a supply depot in Coldfoot to gather equipment, flares, extra batteries for his flashlight, road markers, a handheld GPS unit that could record waypoints. He wasn't sure what would be useful when dealing with a temporal anomaly, but preparation felt better than helplessness. The clerk who sold him the supplies had given him a curious look when he'd requested a dozen notebooks and several permanent markers. Wiley hadn't explained. How could he? He was planning to leave messages for himself across different iterations of time, assuming he survived long enough to write anything. Mile marker 200 appeared, and Wiley felt his heart rate increase. His hands were steady on the wheel, but his mouth was dry. He thought about Hale Broder's warning, about Ivar Lyle's fate, about all the drivers who'd disappeared into whatever existed at Pump Station 7. He was probably making a mistake, probably driving himself toward a fate worse than death. But the alternative was living with the certainty that the loop would eventually reclaim him anyway, and at least this way he was choosing the terms of engagement. Mile marker 190 came and went, then 188, 186. The highway looked completely normal, just another stretch of the Dalton with its endless permafrost and sparse vegetation. No signs of temporal distortion, no ghost trucks, no ice fog. Wiley started to wonder if maybe the loop had released him after all, if throwing away that notebook in Deadhorse had somehow severed the connection. Then he saw mile marker 184 and the access road to Pump Station 7, and he knew nothing had changed. The road looked different in clear weather, more defined, more obviously maintained than it should be for a facility that had been abandoned for decades. Fresh tire tracks led down it, multiple sets, as if a convoy of trucks had recently made the turn. Wiley knew those tracks weren't real in any conventional sense. They were echoes, temporal shadows of all the times this had happened before. All the drivers who'd turned down this road, responding to distress calls that existed outside normal time. He was just the latest iteration in a pattern that stretched back years, maybe decades. He turned onto the access road and immediately felt the change. It was subtle, not the dramatic shift he'd experienced during the ice fog, but definite. The air pressure seemed wrong, and his ears popped like he was gaining altitude even though the road was level. His dashboard clock flickered, numbers jumping forward and backward randomly. The temperature gauge started cycling through impossible readings. His truck's engine sounded different too, the normal diesel rumble overlaid with echoes of itself, creating a discordant harmony that made his teeth ache. Pump Station 7 appeared ahead, and this time Wiley could see it clearly. The buildings looked simultaneously abandoned and occupied, rusted metal coexisting with sections that appeared freshly painted. Lights were on in some windows but not others, and the pattern kept shifting. As he watched, a section of roof that had been collapsed suddenly was intact, then collapsed again. The whole complex was flickering between different states of decay, different moments in time all trying to exist simultaneously. Wiley parked his truck in the same spot as before, and this time he left the engine running. If he needed to escape quickly, every second would matter. He grabbed one of the notebooks and a marker, climbed down from his cab and approached the main building. The door was both open and closed, hanging crooked on its hinges and sitting properly in its frame. Wiley experienced a moment of profound vertigo as his brain tried to process the contradictory visual information. He closed his eyes, took a breath of air that tasted like ozone and diesel fuel, and stepped forward. The interior of the pump station was worse than the exterior. Multiple time frames overlapped here, creating a chaotic jumble of past and present. Equipment that had been rusted and broken in his previous visit was now functional, gauges active and machinery humming. But in the same space, other equipment remained frozen and dead. People moved through the building, transparent and flickering like old film projections. Wiley recognized Ivar Lyle from a description Hale had given him, a thin man with haunted eyes, wearing work coveralls from a decade past. But there were others too. Drivers in gear from different eras, workers in safety equipment that had gone out of use years ago, all of them moving through their routines unaware of each other or of Wiley watching them. He made his way to the radio room, the epicenter of the anomaly. The equipment here was simultaneously ancient and modern, valve-based technology coexisting with solid-state components that shouldn't exist in the same timeline. The walls were covered with those carved messages he'd seen before. But now there were more of them, hundreds more, all appearing and disappearing as the different temporal layers flickered in and out of phase. Wiley pulled out his notebook and added his own message. Wiley Brackett, November 21st, entered voluntarily, attempting to understand the pattern. As soon as he finished writing, the notebook began to fill itself with additional entries. His handwriting appeared on blank pages, documenting experiences he hadn't had yet, or had already had. The temporal confusion was getting worse, and Wiley felt his sense of linear time beginning to break down. He flipped through the notebook and found entries dated years in the future, describing him making this same journey over and over, each time with slightly different details. In some iterations he escaped. In others, he didn't. In still others, the concept of escape became meaningless because time had ceased to flow in any recognizable direction. "You came back." The voice came from behind him, and Wiley spun around. Ivar Lyle stood there, but also didn't stand there. The man flickered in and out of visibility, sometimes solid, sometimes transparent, sometimes not present at all. When he spoke, his words came from multiple moments at once, overlapping themselves. "I knew you would. I wrote it in the logs, or will write it. Tense doesn't mean anything here anymore." Wiley tried to speak, but found his own voice affected by the temporal distortion. His words stretched and compressed, arriving at Lyle's ears before and after he actually spoke them. "How long have you been here?" he managed to ask. Lyle laughed, and the sound was wrong, coming from several different versions of his throat at once. 12 years, and 12 minutes, and forever. It's all the same now. I stopped being able to tell the difference after the first few loops." Lyle gestured at the radio equipment. "This is the anchor point. Whatever happened here, some kind of accident or experiment or just random chance, it created a stable temporal loop anchored to this equipment. Everyone who interacts with it gets caught in the pattern. We're all here, Wiley. Every driver who responded to the distress call. We exist in every iteration simultaneously." Wiley felt his grip on reality loosening. He could see what Lyle meant now. Looking around the room, he could see himself at different ages, different states of wear. A version of himself that had been trapped here for years, weathered and hollow-eyed. Another version that had just arrived moments ago, still confident he could solve this. A third version that was somehow both entering and leaving at the same time, caught in a paradox loop. All of them were him. All of them were real. "Can it be stopped?" Wiley asked, though he already suspected the answer. Lyle flickered through several emotional states: hope, despair, resignation, anger, settling finally on a sad acceptance. "We've tried everything. Destroying the equipment just causes it to exist in a state of being both destroyed and functional. Leaving doesn't work because we're always here, have always been here, will always be here. The loop is self-sustaining. It feeds on our attempts to escape, using them to create new iterations that feed back into the pattern. The only way out is to stop trying to get out, to accept that this is where we are now." Wiley rejected that answer with every fiber of his being. There had to be a solution, had to be some way to break the cycle. He thought about Hale's explanation, about the loop needing anchors to maintain itself. The radio equipment was one anchor, but there were others. The notebooks, the carved messages, the memories themselves. What if the key wasn't to destroy the anchors but to create so many that the pattern became unstable? What if he could overload the loop with contradictory information until it collapsed under its own weight? He started writing in his notebook, creating entries that contradicted everything else. Dates that couldn't exist. Descriptions of events that couldn't have happened. Messages addressed to people who'd never been here. He carved new messages on the walls with his marker, filling every available surface with temporal paradoxes and logical impossibilities. Around him, other versions of himself began doing the same thing, all of them reaching the same conclusion across different iterations. The radio room filled with contradictory information, layer upon layer of mutually exclusive truths. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The temporal flickering accelerated, time frames bleeding into each other with increasing chaos. Equipment aged centuries in seconds, then reversed. Walls built themselves and collapsed simultaneously. Wiley saw Lyle age from his 30s to his 90s and back to childhood, all within a single breath. The loop was destabilizing, unable to maintain coherence in the face of so much paradox. Reality itself seemed to be tearing at the seams, but instead of collapsing entirely, the loop began to adapt. It started incorporating the paradoxes, making them part of the pattern. The contradictions became new anchor points, new stable elements around which the loop could organize itself. Wiley realized with horror that he hadn't broken the pattern. He'd made it stronger, given it more complexity, more ways to trap future victims. His attempt to overload the system had backfired spectacularly. "You see now," Lyle said, his voice sad but not surprised. "The loop learns. It adapts. Every attempt to destroy it just makes it more sophisticated. That's why we're all still here. That's why we'll always be here. We're not victims anymore. We're part of the mechanism now. We're what keeps it running." Wiley felt something shift inside him, some fundamental alteration of his relationship to time and space. He could feel the loop now, could sense its structure and function. He was becoming integrated into it, becoming another component of the mechanism that trapped drivers and twisted reality. Part of him was still in his truck, engine idling, hand reaching for the door handle to leave. Another part had been here for years, trapped and hollow. A third part hadn't arrived yet but would arrive soon. All of these versions existed simultaneously, and all of them were equally real. He tried to hold on to his sense of self, tried to maintain the belief that he was Wiley Brackett, that he had a linear history and a future. But those concepts were losing meaning. He could remember his childhood and his old age with equal clarity. He could recall conversations that hadn't happened yet and events that would never occur. His identity was fragmenting across multiple time frames, becoming something that existed not as a person, but as a pattern. A recurring event in a loop that had no beginning and no end. Through the chaos, he caught glimpses of other drivers trapped in similar states. Orson Vale, mentioned in those forum posts, existed as a permanent echo in one corner of the facility. Ambrose Pike was locked in a moment of perpetual arrival, always pulling up to the pump station but never quite making it out of his truck. And there were others, dozens of others. All of them caught at different points in their personal loops, all of them contributing to the overall pattern that sustained the anomaly. Wiley made one final attempt to leave a warning, a message that might reach someone in the outside world. He grabbed his notebook and wrote with shaking hands, "Pump Station 7, Temporal Anomaly. Do not investigate. Do not respond to distress calls. The loop takes everyone." But even as he wrote, he could see the words changing, adapting, becoming part of the mechanism that would lure future drivers. The warning was being incorporated into the pattern, turned into bait, transformed into another tool the loop could use to sustain itself. He laughed then, and the sound echoed across multiple time frames. Of course, the warnings were never meant to keep people away. They were meant to draw certain types of people in. The curious ones, the brave ones, the ones who thought they could solve the mystery. Those were the ones the loop needed. The ones whose attempts to escape created the most energy, the most complexity. Wiley had been perfect for it. His stubborn refusal to accept defeat, his determination to understand and overcome the anomaly, all of that had made him an ideal component for the mechanism. "Will anyone else come?" he asked Lyle, though he already knew the answer. Lyle flickered through his various states before settling on something approximating the present moment. They always come. The loop sends out its distress call and eventually someone responds. Someone like us. Someone who won't ignore a call for help. And when they arrive, they find the notebooks and the warnings and the evidence that something impossible exists here. And that evidence pulls them in deeper, makes them part of the pattern. We're the bait now, Wiley. We're what draws the next victims. Our warnings are their invitation. Wiley walked to the window and looked out at his truck. Multiple versions of his truck, actually, from different time frames. In some iterations it was running and he could escape. In others it was buried in snow, trapped by weather that existed in a different temporal layer. In still others, the truck didn't exist at all because this was a moment before he'd arrived or after he'd left. All possibilities existed simultaneously, and none of them offered genuine escape. He could see movement on the highway beyond the access road. Another truck approaching, slowing down, responding to a distress call that Wiley himself was now transmitting across time. The loop continuing its cycle, drawing in another driver who would go through the same progression of discovery and horror and eventual integration. Wiley wanted to warn them, wanted to somehow break the pattern, but he was the pattern now. His warnings would only pull them in deeper. The new truck turned onto the access road and Wiley watched himself, watched Ivar Lyle, watched all the other trapped drivers go through their various iterations. They were all here, had always been here, would always be here. Time had become a circle at the pump station 7, and everyone caught in it was doomed to repeat their journey forever, experiencing every moment of horror and realization and acceptance on an endless loop. Wiley picked up his marker and added one final message to the wall, knowing it would join the hundreds of others, knowing it would become just another piece of the mechanism. The loop is patient. It has all the time in the world. Because here, time is all there is. He watched the new truck park where he had parked, watched a driver climb down who might or might not be him in a different iteration. The cycle was beginning again, or continuing, or had never stopped. The distinction had ceased to matter. Wiley existed in all moments now, simultaneously warning and luring, escaping and trapped, aware and oblivious. He was part of Pump Station 7's eternal pattern, another voice echoing across time, another driver who'd answered a call that should never have been answered. Somewhere outside the loop, on a highway that still experienced linear time, other trucks continued their journeys. Dispatchers logged positions and weather reports came through clear and uncorrupted. The Dalton Highway stretched across Alaska like it always had, dangerous and beautiful and mostly comprehensible. But at mile marker 184, in a place that existed wrong, Pump Station 7 continued its patient work. The distress call echoed across frequencies and time periods, waiting for the next driver who couldn't ignore someone in trouble, who would turn down that access road and become part of something that transcended simple haunting. Wiley Brackett was that loop now, was the warning and the trap, the victim and the mechanism. His truck sat outside with its engine running, would sit there forever, had never really arrived at all. And in the radio room where time folded back on itself in ways that broke human comprehension, his voice joined the chorus of other trapped drivers, sending out calls for help that were really invitations to join them in their eternal, circular nightmare. The loop continued, would always continue, had never stopped continuing, and at mile marker 184 in the failing Arctic light, Pump Station 7 waited. Orson Vale had been driving freight through the Yukon Territory for 7 years, and he'd learned to read weather the way some men read books. The sky told stories if you knew how to listen, and the story it was telling him now was simple and brutal. Get off the road or die. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the last hour, and the wind was building from the northwest with the kind of steady purpose that meant a major storm system was moving in. Ice crystals already danced across his windshield, forerunners of what was coming. Orson had maybe an hour before the full blizzard hit, and out here in the backcountry between Whitehorse and Dawson City, an hour wasn't much time to find shelter. He was hauling mining equipment to a claim site north of Dawson, a route that kept him off the main highways and on secondary roads that saw maybe 3 vehicles a day in good weather. The pay was excellent precisely because the roads were terrible and the risks were high. Most drivers refused runs like this, especially in winter. But Orson had grown up in northern Manitoba and knew cold the way city people knew traffic patterns. He respected it, prepared for it, and usually managed to stay one step ahead of it. Usually. This storm had come up faster than the weather service predicted, and now he was caught between locations with nowhere obvious to wait it out. The road ahead disappeared into white as the wind picked up. Snow that had been on the ground suddenly airborne, and mixing with fresh snow falling from clouds the color of old bruises. Visibility dropped to maybe 50 feet, then 30. Orson slowed to a crawl, watching for the subtle differences in snow texture that marked where the road ended and the ditch began. His truck had good winter tires and plenty of weight, but physics didn't care about preparation. Slide off into a ditch out here and he'd freeze before help arrived, if help arrived at all. His dispatcher knew his general route but not his exact position, and the storm would ground any rescue aircraft for days. He'd been creeping forward for about 20 minutes, covering maybe 2 miles when he saw the sign. It appeared suddenly out of the white. An old wooden post with hand-painted letters that read Morna's Roadhouse, 1 mile, food, fuel, lodging. Orson felt a surge of relief so intense it was almost dizzying. He'd driven this road a dozen times and never noticed a roadhouse, but that didn't mean much. There were dozens of small operations scattered across the Yukon, family businesses that served trappers and miners, and the occasional trucker. Some of them barely advertised because they didn't need to. The locals knew where they were, and that was enough. The access road was barely visible, just 2 ruts in the snow leading off to the right. Orson took the turn carefully, feeling his trailer slide slightly before the tires caught and pulled him straight. The road climbed a small rise and wound through a stand of spruce trees that provided some shelter from the wind. Then the roadhouse appeared, a low building with warm light spilling from its windows, smoke rising from a stone chimney. There were 3 vehicles parked in front, 2 pickup trucks and a smaller delivery van, and Orson felt his anxiety ease another notch. Other people meant safety, meant witnesses, meant he wouldn't be alone if something went wrong. He parked his rig off to the side where it wouldn't block the other vehicles and shut down his engine. The wind hit him like a fist when he opened the door, stealing his breath and making his eyes water. The temperature had dropped even further, probably down to -30 or worse with the wind chill. Orson grabbed his pack with his overnight gear and made his way to the roadhouse door, head down against the wind, counting his steps to make sure he didn't veer off course. 10 steps, 15. His hand found the door handle and he yanked it open, stumbling into blessed warmth and sudden quiet as the door shut behind him. The interior was exactly what he'd expected from a backcountry roadhouse. Low ceiling with exposed beams, rough-hewn wooden walls decorated with old snowshoes and trapping gear, a stone fireplace where a serious fire burned. There were maybe 8 tables scattered around the main room, and a bar along one wall with bottles and glasses arranged behind it. The smell of food, something with meat and onions, made his stomach growl. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until that moment. 3 people sat at different tables, locals by the look of them, and they glanced up as he entered before returning to their meals. Normal behavior, nothing unusual. "Well now, you made it just in time." The voice came from behind the bar, and Orson turned to see a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. She had the weathered face of someone who'd spent years in the north, lines around her eyes that spoke of squinting into bright snow and harsh wind. Her smile was genuine and welcoming. "Storm's going to be a bad one. You're lucky you saw our sign. I'm Morna Quayle. This is my place." Orson introduced himself and explained he was hauling mining equipment north, got caught by the storm, needed a place to wait it out. Morna nodded as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "Happens all the time this time of year. Weather Service can't predict these systems worth a damn. You need a room and a meal?" Orson confirmed that he did, and Morna quoted him prices that were higher than he'd normally pay but reasonable given the isolation and circumstances. He agreed without haggling. Out here, arguing about money was pointless and rude. You paid what was asked, or you froze. A young man emerged from what looked like a kitchen doorway, carrying plates of food for one of the tables. He was maybe 25, tall and thin with dark hair, and an awkward way of moving that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable in his own body. He delivered the food, cleared some empty glasses, and headed back toward the kitchen without making eye contact with anyone. "That's Hale," Morna explained. "He helps me keep the place running. Good worker, doesn't talk much." She gestured toward an empty table near the fireplace. "Go ahead and sit. I'll bring you some stew and bread. Coffee's on the bar if you want it now." Orson poured himself coffee from a large urn and settled at the table Morna had indicated. The heat from the fireplace was intense and wonderful, and he felt his cold, stiffened muscles beginning to relax. He watched the other patrons through lowered eyelashes, the automatic assessment that came from years on the road. 2 men at separate tables, both dressed in work clothes that could belong to trappers or prospectors. One was older, maybe 60, with a gray beard and the kind of stillness that suggested either deep thought or extreme fatigue. The other was younger, 40s perhaps, with nervous energy that had him constantly shifting position and drumming his fingers on the table. Neither paid any attention to Orson beyond that first glance. Hale emerged again, this time carrying a bowl of stew and a plate of bread, which he set in front of Orson without a word. Up close, the young man looked even more uncomfortable, his eyes darting around like he expected something bad to happen. "Thanks," Orson said, but Hale had already turned away, heading back toward the kitchen. Strange kid, but lots of people who ended up in places like this were running from something or dealing with issues that made social interaction difficult. Orson had learned not to judge. The North attracted all kinds, and as long as they weren't actively dangerous, their personal demons were their own business. The stew was excellent, rich and hearty with chunks of meat that might have been caribou or moose, vegetables that were probably canned but prepared well, thick broth that warmed him from the inside. Orson ate methodically, taking his time, listening to the wind howl outside and feeling grateful to be inside. Morna moved around the room, checking on the other patrons, adding wood to the fire, maintaining the comfortable atmosphere that made the roadhouse feel safe and welcoming. This was exactly the kind of place Orson appreciated. No pretense, no unnecessary decoration, just solid functionality and genuine hospitality. He was halfway through his meal when he noticed the first odd detail. One of the other patrons, the older man with the beard, was eating the exact same meal Orson had. That in itself wasn't unusual. Roadhouses typically had limited menus, and stew was common fare. But the man's bowl looked identical to Orson's. Not just the same food, but the same amount, arranged the same way, with the bread on a plate positioned at the same angle. Like they'd been served from the same photograph, rather than from an actual pot of stew. Orson told himself he was being paranoid, seeing patterns where none existed. Of course, the servings would look similar. Morna probably had a practiced hand at portioning meals, but once he'd noticed that detail, other things started to catch his attention. The nervous younger patron kept glancing toward the kitchen door, not with the expectation of someone waiting for food, but with something that looked more like fear. His fingers drummed a pattern on the table. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause, with metronomic regularity. And every time Hale came out of the kitchen, the man's whole body would tense, though he never looked directly at the young helper. The older, bearded man showed no reaction at all, just continued eating with the same mechanical precision, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. Orson finished his stew and pushed the bowl away, feeling the pleasant fullness of a good meal. Morna appeared at his elbow almost immediately, as if she'd been watching for him to finish. Rooms upstairs, second door on the right, clean sheets, wood stove to keep you warm. Bathrooms at the end of the hall, water's heated from the main boiler so it should be hot. You need anything else before you turn in? Orson asked about his truck, whether it would be safe parked where it was. Morna assured him it would be fine. Nobody's going anywhere in this storm. Your rig will be buried by morning, but that's all. We'll help you dig out when the weather clears. He paid for his meal and room, the transaction smooth and professional, then headed upstairs with his pack. The second floor was a narrow hallway with 4 doors, 3 bedrooms, and the bathroom Morna had mentioned. His room was small but adequate. Single bed with heavy quilts, wood stove with a supply of split wood beside it, small window that showed nothing but white as the storm raged outside. The walls were bare wood, worn smooth by years of use, and there was a smell of old smoke and pine. Orson set his pack on the bed and went to check the bathroom. That's where he found the second odd detail. The bathroom was clean and functional, but the mirror above the sink showed signs of having been recently replaced. The frame was old and weathered like everything else in the roadhouse, but the glass itself was new, with sharp edges and no signs of wear. And around the edges of the mirror, where it met the frame, Orson could see what looked like caulking or sealant that was still slightly soft. This mirror had been installed within the last few days, maybe the last few hours. Why would someone replace a bathroom mirror in the middle of winter, in a remote roadhouse that probably saw minimal business this time of year? He went back to his room and lit the wood stove, watching as the kindling caught and the larger pieces began to burn. The heat was immediate and comforting, but Orson found himself unable to relax. Small details kept nagging at him. The way all 3 patrons downstairs had been eating the same meal, the nervous tension of the younger man, Hale's obvious discomfort, the brand-new mirror. None of it was overtly wrong, but taken together, it created a sense that something was off about this place. Like a picture where all the elements were correct, but arranged in a way that didn't quite make sense. He unpacked his emergency radio, a battery-powered unit that could pick up both AM/FM stations and weather bands. He turned it on and scanned through the frequencies, looking for news or updates about the storm. What he got was static on most channels, which was normal given the weather and their remote location. But on one frequency, he picked up something odd. It sounded like voices, multiple people talking over each other, but the words were indistinct and the rhythm was wrong. Not like normal conversation, but like recordings of conversations played at slightly different speeds and overlapped. He adjusted the tuning, trying to clear up the signal, but it just made the effect worse. The voices seemed to get louder and more insistent, and underneath them he could hear what might have been music or might have been machinery. Orson turned off the radio and sat on the bed, listening to the storm outside and the house creaking around him. Downstairs he could hear footsteps moving across the floor, voices talking too quietly to make out words, the occasional clatter of dishes, normal sounds, a roadhouse operating normally. He told himself he was being paranoid, that isolation and the storm were making him see threats where none existed. Morna had been nothing but hospitable. The food had been good. The room was comfortable. There was no reason to be suspicious. But when he lay down and closed his eyes, he couldn't sleep. His mind kept circling back to those details, the identical meals, the new mirror, the strange radio transmission, and something else, something he'd noticed subconsciously but hadn't fully processed until now. When he'd first entered the roadhouse, Morna had said, "You made it just in time," as if she'd been expecting him specifically. Not "someone made it," but "you." How had she known someone was coming? The storm would make it nearly impossible to see vehicle lights approaching, and the access road was hidden enough that you wouldn't notice traffic just passing by on the main road. Orson sat up and went to the window, looking out at the storm. He couldn't see his truck anymore, just white on white, the world reduced to swirling snow and darkness. But as he watched, he thought he saw movement out there. Not the random movement of wind-driven snow, but something more purposeful. Shapes moving through the white too large to be animals, but too indistinct to identify. He counted 3 of them, or maybe 4, moving in a pattern that suggested they were searching for something, or guarding something. He pressed his face closer to the glass, trying to see better. And that's when he noticed the 3rd odd detail. His breath wasn't fogging the window. The room was warm from the wood stove, and outside was well below freezing, but his breath left no condensation on the glass. He touched the window with his finger and felt it was warm, almost hot, like there was a heat source on the other side. That made no sense. The window should be the coldest surface in the room, the point where interior warmth met exterior cold. But it was warm, and getting warmer, as if whatever was outside wasn't a frozen winter storm, but something else entirely. Downstairs someone screamed. The sound was cut off abruptly, but Orson had heard enough to identify it as male, probably one of the other patrons. He grabbed his flashlight from his pack and opened his door, listening. The roadhouse had gone completely silent. No voices, no footsteps, no normal sounds of activity. Just the wind outside and the creak of old wood settling. Orson stepped into the hallway, every instinct telling him to stay in his room and lock the door. But another human being had screamed, and even in a place as strange as this was becoming, he couldn't ignore that. He moved towards the stairs slowly, flashlight off to preserve his night vision, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light that came from the floor below. At the top of the stairs he paused, listening for any sound that would tell him what was happening. Nothing. The silence was oppressive, waited, like the moment before something terrible happens. Orson descended one step, then another, his boots making small sounds on the wooden treads that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet. Halfway down the stairs, he could see into the main room. The fire still burned in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The tables were exactly as they'd been, but the people were gone. All 3 patrons had vanished, though their meals sat half-finished, steam still rising from the bowls. Morna wasn't behind the bar. Hale wasn't visible in the kitchen doorway. The roadhouse felt abandoned, though Orson knew that was impossible. He'd been upstairs for maybe 20 minutes. No one could have left in that time, not in this storm. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped into the main room, sweeping his gaze across every corner and shadow. The front door was closed and looked undisturbed. Snow piled against it from outside. The kitchen door was open, showing darkness beyond. The fire crackled and popped, and outside the wind continued its relentless howl. But inside, nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Orson was alone in a roadhouse that moments ago had been occupied by 5 other people, and he had no idea where they'd gone or why that man had screamed. Then he noticed the tracks, footprints in melted snow on the wooden floor, leading from the kitchen door to the space behind the bar. Multiple sets, overlapping, some of them showing strange drag marks like something heavy had been pulled. The prints were fresh. The water hadn't dried yet, which meant they'd been made recently. But it wasn't snowing inside, which meant someone had tracked in snow from outside, and it had melted. Why would there be snow in the kitchen? Unless there was another door back there, a way out that he hadn't seen. Orson followed the tracks behind the bar, where they led to a section of wall that looked slightly different from the rest. Not obviously a door, but not quite solid wall either. He pressed against it and felt it give slightly. A hidden door, or at least a concealed one. The tracks led through it, along with those strange drag marks. He had 2 choices: follow the tracks and find out where everyone had gone, or go back to his room and wait for the storm to pass, pretending he hadn't noticed anything wrong. Neither option felt safe, but staying in the main room felt even less safe. Exposed and visible with his back to multiple doorways. At least if he followed the tracks, he'd know what he was dealing with. Orson pushed harder on the wall section and felt it swing inward on hidden hinges, revealing a dark passage that led deeper into the building, or possibly underground. Cold air flowed from the opening, carrying a smell that was wrong. Copper and something organic and spoiled like meat that had been left out too long. He turned on his flashlight and stepped through the hidden door, following the tracks into darkness, leaving the warm, safe light of the fire behind. The passage sloped downward, and the walls changed from finished wood to rough stone. The temperature dropped with each step until his breath was visible again and frost formed on the walls. The tracks continued ahead of him, and now he could hear something. A rhythmic sound like breathing or machinery coming from somewhere below, and underneath that, very faint, the sound of voices talking in that same overlapping pattern he'd heard on his radio. The passage opened into a larger space, and Orson stopped at the threshold, his flashlight beam revealing something that made his blood freeze colder than any Arctic storm. The room beyond was not part of any roadhouse. It couldn't be. And the things he saw there, the things that wore human shapes but were decidedly not human, were waiting for him with a patience that suggested they'd been waiting a very long time. Orson's flashlight beam swept across the underground room, and his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The space was larger than should be possible given the roadhouse's footprint above. Stone walls curved away into darkness, their surfaces carved with symbols that might have been words in a language Orson didn't recognize, or might have been decorative patterns that only looked like language. The floor was dirt, packed hard from years of use, and marked with those same drag patterns he'd followed from upstairs. But it was the objects in the room that froze him in place. There were crates stacked against one wall, dozens of them. Old wooden boxes with shipping labels so faded they were illegible. Some had been pried open, revealing contents that made no sense. Personal belongings, clothing, photographs, identification documents, watches, and jewelry, all sorted and organized like inventory in a warehouse. Orson moved closer, shining his light on the nearest open crate, and felt his stomach turn. These weren't just random belongings, they were sorted by type and era. One crate held only driver's licenses, hundreds of them, faces staring up from plastic cards. Another contained trucker logbooks, the old paper kind that had been phased out years ago. A third was full of CB radios, all different models spanning decades of technology. These were the belongings of drivers. Truckers who'd stopped here over the years, maybe decades. And the sheer volume of items suggested there had been many of them, far more than any legitimate roadhouse would see even in a busy season. Orson's hand trembled as he picked up one of the licenses. The photo showed a man in his 40s with a beard, smiling at the camera. The issue date was 1987. He picked up another, 1993, another 2001. They went back decades, an archive of drivers who'd passed through this place. But where were the drivers themselves? A sound from deeper in the underground space made Orson spin around, his flashlight beam cutting through darkness. He could see movement now, shapes that resolved into human forms as they moved into his light. Morna Quayle stood there, and beside her was Hale Broder. But they looked different down here. Morna's welcoming smile was gone, replaced by an expression that was harder to read. Not hostile exactly, but not friendly either. Clinical, maybe, like she was observing an interesting specimen. Hale stood behind her, his earlier nervousness replaced by a blank emptiness that was somehow worse. "You weren't supposed to come down here yet," Morna said, her voice carrying the same warmth it had upstairs, but with a new undertone that made the words feel like a threat. "Most guests wait until morning. It makes things easier." Orson kept his flashlight trained on them, his other hand moving slowly toward the knife on his belt. "What is this place? Where are the other people from upstairs?" Morna tilted her head slightly, the gesture reminiscent of a bird studying prey. "The others are being processed. They come here because they need shelter, because the storm catches them unprepared, because I make sure they see my sign when they're desperate. And once they're here, once they've eaten my food and accepted my hospitality, they become part of the inventory." She gestured at the crates with something that might have been pride. "We've been doing this for a very long time. The North is good for business. Isolated routes, unpredictable weather, drivers who disappear and are assumed to be victims of the conditions. No one questions it too closely." Orson felt his mouth go dry. "You're robbing truckers, killing them and stealing their belongings." Morna's expression suggested he was close to understanding, but not quite there. Robbing is such a crude word. We're collecting, preserving, and we don't kill anyone, not exactly. The North does that for us. The cold, the isolation, the hunger. We just facilitate the process, help it along, guide people toward their inevitable end, and make sure nothing goes to waste. She moved closer, and Orson noticed that her feet made no sound on the dirt floor. "You're different from most who come here, more observant. You notice the details, the meals, the mirror, the tracks. Most don't see anything until it's too late. But you started questioning almost immediately. That makes you interesting. It also makes you dangerous." Behind her, Hale began to move, circling to Orson's left with the mechanical precision of someone following rehearsed patterns. Orson backed toward the passage he'd come through, keeping both of them in his field of vision. The people upstairs, the other patrons, where are they? Morna's smile returned, but it was wrong now, too wide, showing too many teeth. "They're completing their transition. Everyone who eats here who accepts our hospitality begins a process. The food contains certain elements, nothing immediately harmful, but over time, over the course of a night or two, it changes things, makes people more compliant, more willing to accept their fate. By morning, they don't want to leave. They understand that this is where they belong now." The implications hit Orson like a physical blow. He'd eaten the stew. Whatever was in that food was inside him now, beginning whatever process Morna described. He felt normal, alert, afraid, angry, but how long would that last? What happens to them after they're compliant? Morna gestured deeper into the underground space where Orson's flashlight beam couldn't quite reach. "They go into the cold storage. We have natural caves back there, permafrost that keeps things preserved indefinitely." When we need to clear out more room, when the inventory gets too full, we take them up into the mountains. There are places up there where bodies never thaw, never decay. They just become part of the landscape. The north is full of frozen things, Orson. A few more don't make any difference. She knew his name. He hadn't told her his last name, just Orson, but she'd used both, which meant she'd gone through his truck or his belongings while he was upstairs learning about him, adding him to her mental inventory. The violation of that felt almost as terrible as the threat to his life. Orson pulled his knife, a 6-inch blade that suddenly felt pathetically inadequate. I'm leaving, now, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows about this place. Morna laughed, and the sound echoed strangely off the stone walls. With what evidence? The roadhouse will be gone by the time you could bring anyone back. We move regularly. This building, everything you see, it's all designed to be dismantled and relocated in a matter of hours. We've done it dozens of times over the years, always staying ahead of anyone who might get suspicious. And even if you somehow led them to this exact spot, all they'd find is an empty foundation and some old stones. We're very good at disappearing. Hale had continued his circling maneuver and was now between Orson and the passage out. The young man moved with a strange, fluid grace that suggested he was much more capable than his awkward, upstairs demeanor had indicated. Orson realized the nervousness, the discomfort, had all been an act, a performance designed to make victims underestimate him. Now, with his real nature revealed, Hale moved like a predator, efficient and confident. You have a choice, Morna continued, her voice taking on a reasonable, almost soothing quality. You can fight, try to escape, probably die in the storm within an hour of leaving here. Or you can accept what's happening. Let the process continue and simply go to sleep when the time comes. It's not painful. Most people don't even realize what's happening until it's too late. They just feel tired, content, ready to rest. It's actually quite peaceful. Orson's mind raced through options. He couldn't go back through the passage with Hale blocking it. He couldn't fight both of them, not in close quarters with just a knife. And even if he somehow won that fight, he'd still be trapped in a roadhouse that might not even exist by morning. Miles from any help, in the middle of a blizzard. But surrender meant accepting their process, meant ending up as just another license in one of those crates, another cautionary tale that no one would ever hear. He made his decision and lunged forward, not at Hale or Morna, but at the stacked crates. He swept his arm across the nearest pile, sending boxes crashing to the floor, spilling their contents across the dirt. Driver's licenses, photographs, personal effects scattered everywhere. Morna made a sound of genuine distress, not fear, but frustration, like someone whose careful organization had been disrupted. "That's years of work," she shouted, and for the first time, her composed demeanor cracked. Orson used her momentary distraction to dodge past Hale, taking a glancing blow to his shoulder as the young man tried to grab him. He ran for the passage, flashlight beam bouncing wildly, the sound of pursuit immediately behind him. The upward slope felt steeper now, his legs burning with effort, his breath coming in gasps. Behind him, he could hear Hale's footsteps, steady and unhurried, like someone who knew the chase would be short. The hidden door at the top of the passage was still open, showing the warm light of the roadhouse beyond. Orson burst through it and immediately grabbed the nearest heavy object, a chair, and wedged it under the door's edge, blocking it from opening further. It wouldn't hold long, but it might buy him seconds. He ran for the front door, yanking it open to face the full force of the storm. The wind nearly knocked him backward, and the cold was so intense it felt like a solid wall. Snow blasted into his face, blinding him, and he couldn't see more than a foot ahead. His truck was out there somewhere, but he'd never find it in this whiteout. Even if he did, it would be buried in snow, and starting it in this cold after it had been sitting for hours would be nearly impossible. Behind him, he heard the chair splinter as hail forced the hidden door open. Orson plunged into the storm anyway, because staying meant certain death while running meant possible death, and possible was better than certain. The snow was waist-deep in the drifts, and every step was a struggle. He couldn't feel his face anymore, and his hands were already going numb despite his gloves. This was how people died in the north. Not dramatically, but through simple exposure, the cold draining warmth and strength until there was nothing left. He thought he saw a shape ahead. His truck, maybe, and staggered toward it. But as he got closer, he realized it was just a large snowdrift, his desperation turning random geography into false hope. He spun around, trying to orient himself, but the storm had completely disoriented him. He couldn't see the roadhouse anymore, couldn't see anything except white in every direction. The wind carried away his shouts before they fully formed. He was alone in a white void, freezing to death, and no one would ever know what had happened to him. Then he saw the lights, not the warm yellow glow of the roadhouse, but colder blue-white lights, moving through the snow in a pattern that didn't match the chaotic movement of the storm. The shapes he'd seen from his window earlier, now revealed as figures carrying lanterns or flashlights, moving with purpose through the blizzard. They were spreading out, forming a perimeter, cutting off any possible escape route. Orson realized with horror that they were hurting him, pushing him back toward the roadhouse, using the storm and his disorientation to funnel him exactly where they wanted him to go. He changed direction, forcing himself deeper into the storm, away from the lights. If they expected him to try to return to shelter, he'd do the opposite. He'd find somewhere to dig in, create a snow cave, wait out the worst of the storm. It was a desperate plan with a low chance of success, but it was better than being captured. The lights followed, adjusting their pattern, and Orson realized they were coordinating somehow, communicating silently or through signals he couldn't perceive. How many people were involved in Morna's operation? How large was this network of killers? His foot caught on something buried in the snow and he fell hard, his flashlight flying from his grip and disappearing into a drift. He scrambled to his hands and knees, pawing through the snow, and his hand closed on something that wasn't snow, something hard and cold and unmistakably the shape of a frozen human hand. Orson recoiled, but his survival instinct made him look closer. The body was partially uncovered by the wind, face down in the snow, wearing a parka similar to his own. A trucker who'd tried to escape, maybe months or years ago, now frozen and preserved by the Arctic cold. And scattered around the body were others, a whole graveyard of victims that the snow periodically revealed and concealed. He'd stumbled into Morna's dumping ground, the place where she brought the bodies after the cold storage got too full. How many were buried here? Dozens? Hundreds? The realization hit him that even if he somehow escaped the storm, even if he made it to civilization and told authorities, finding this exact location again would be nearly impossible. Morna had chosen her hunting ground perfectly, remote enough that people disappeared without raising immediate alarms, harsh enough that deaths could be attributed to natural causes, and vast enough that evidence could be scattered across miles of wilderness and never found. The blue-white lights were getting closer, converging on his position. They'd seen him fall, were moving in for capture. Orson forced himself to his feet and kept moving, but his strength was fading. The cold was winning, as it always did up here. His thoughts were becoming sluggish, his movements uncoordinated. The first stage of hypothermia. If he didn't find shelter soon, real shelter, not Morna's trap, he would die regardless of whether they caught him or not. Then, through the storm, he saw something that didn't fit the pattern. A dark shape that wasn't moving, too angular to be natural. Another building, smaller than the roadhouse, maybe an old trapper's cabin or equipment shed. It was a gamble. Could be another of Morna's structures, another trap. But Orson was out of choices. He staggered toward it, using the last of his strength, and found a door. The wood was old and weathered but solid, and when he pushed against it, it swung open. The interior was dark and smelled of old wood and abandonment. Definitely not maintained by Morna. This place had the genuine feeling of long disuse. Orson stumbled inside and pushed the door closed behind him, his hands so numb he could barely grip the latch. He couldn't see anything in the darkness. Couldn't tell if the structure was sound or if there were holes that would let the storm in. But it was shelter of a sort, better than being outside, and the small space would retain what little body heat he had left. He slumped against the wall, feeling consciousness starting to slip. The hypothermia was advancing, his core temperature dropping despite his heavy clothing. He needed fire, needed warmth, but his hands wouldn't cooperate enough to dig through his pockets for matches or lighter. His flashlight was gone, lost in the snow. All he could do was huddle in the darkness and try to stay awake, because falling asleep now would be falling asleep permanently. Time became meaningless. Orson drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes certain he heard voices outside, sometimes sure he heard nothing but the wind. His thoughts turned strange, fragmented, and he couldn't tell if what he was experiencing was real or hallucination. He saw Morna's face in the darkness, heard her voice explaining that the process would be peaceful, that he should just let go. He saw the frozen bodies in the snow, their faces turning to look at him, mouths opening to speak warnings or pleas or accusations. Then, cutting through the confusion, he heard a different sound. Not the wind, not Morna's voice, but the unmistakable rumble of a diesel engine. A big engine, a truck engine, growing louder. Headlights swept across the walls of his shelter, bright enough to penetrate the gaps in the old wood. Someone else was out here, another vehicle, possibly another victim heading toward the roadhouse. Orson tried to call out, to warn them, but his voice came as barely a whisper. He forced himself to stand, his legs shaking with effort, and pushed toward the door. He got it open and saw the truck, a semi like his own, moving slowly through the storm, its headlights creating cones of light through the driving snow. It was heading away from where the roadhouse had been, which meant either it hadn't stopped there or had already escaped. Orson waved his arms, a feeble gesture that was probably invisible in the storm, and tried again to shout. The truck began to pass, and Orson felt despair crash over him. This was his last chance, his only hope, and it was leaving. But the truck stopped. The engine note changed as it shifted to idle. The driver had seen him, or seen his shelter, or something had made them stop. The passenger door opened and a figure climbed down, bundled against the cold, carrying a powerful flashlight. The beam found Orson, and he heard a voice. Male, older, concerned. "Jesus Christ, you're freezing to death. Come on, let's get you in the cab." Strong hands gripped Orson's arms and half carried, half dragged him to the truck. The interior was wonderfully warm, heat blasting from the vents, and Orson collapsed into the passenger seat. The driver climbed back in and studied him with experienced eyes. Hypothermia. Not too far gone yet, but close. What the hell are you doing out here on foot? The driver pulled blankets from the sleeper berth and wrapped them around Orson, then produced a thermos of coffee that was still hot. "Drink this, small sips. Don't talk until you warm up a bit." Orson's hands shook so badly he could barely hold the thermos, but the hot liquid helped. Feeling began to return to his extremities, painful but welcome. After several minutes, when his shaking had reduced enough to speak clearly, he tried to explain. "Roadhouse. Stopped there. They're killing truckers. The words came out disjointed and confused, and he could see doubt in the driver's expression. "Easy now, you're not making sense. There's no roadhouse on this road. Just empty backcountry for 60 miles in each direction," Orson insisted, describing the sign, the building, Morna and Hale, the underground room full of stolen belongings. The driver listened patiently, his doubt gradually shifting to concern. "I've been running this route for 15 years. There's never been a roadhouse where you're describing. Are you sure you didn't imagine it? Hypothermia can cause hallucinations." But Orson knew what he'd seen, what he'd experienced. The stew he'd eaten, the warmth of the fire, the solid reality of that building. It had been real. It was real. Unless Morna had been telling the truth about the roadhouse being designed to disappear. Unless what felt like hours inside had actually been much longer, and they'd already packed up and relocated, leaving no trace. Or unless the hypothermia had started earlier than he thought, his memories of the roadhouse a confused dream mixing with reality. He didn't know anymore, couldn't trust his own perceptions. But his pack was missing, along with all his belongings. His truck was somewhere out there, probably buried, and he was alive when he should have been dead, which meant something had happened, whether his memory of it was accurate or not. The driver radioed ahead to report the situation, calling for emergency services and asking about other missing truckers on this route. While they waited for a response, Orson looked out at the storm and thought about Morna's face, her calm explanation of how the operation worked. Whether she was real or hallucination, whether the roadhouse existed or was just a construction of his freezing mind, he knew one thing with certainty. The North was full of dangers, and not all of them were natural. Some predators had learned to use isolation and weather as weapons, and somewhere out there in the white, they were still hunting. The rescue driver's name was Keir Hollis, and he ran a small freight operation out of Whitehorse. He'd been hauling supplies to a mining camp when the storm hit and decided to push through rather than wait it out. Finding Orson had been pure chance. He'd seen what he thought was an old trapper's cabin and stopped to check if anyone was sheltering there. "You're lucky I'm stubborn," Keir said, as he maneuvered his truck back onto what passed for a road. "Most drivers would have holed up hours ago." Orson nodded, still wrapped in blankets, still shaking despite the cab's warmth. He couldn't stop thinking about the roadhouse, about Morna's calm explanation of her operation, about those crates full of stolen belongings. They drove in silence for a while, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Keir kept his speed low, his attention focused entirely on keeping the truck on the road. Orson used the time to organize his thoughts, to separate what he was certain he'd experienced from what might have been hypothermia-induced confusion. He'd definitely stopped somewhere. He'd definitely eaten something. And his truck was definitely missing, which meant he hadn't imagined all of it. But the details, the underground chamber, the bodies in the snow, Morna's confession, those could have been distorted by cold and fear and the early stages of freezing to death. After about an hour, Keir's radio crackled to life. A dispatcher asking about his position and whether he'd found the stranded driver he'd reported. Keir confirmed, gave their approximate location, and asked about conditions ahead. The dispatcher reported that the storm was expected to last another 12 hours at least, and advised finding shelter at the next available location. Keir signed off and glanced at Orson. "There's a proper truck stop about 40 miles ahead. We can wait out the storm there, get you checked by a medic, and figure out what to do about your rig." Orson wanted to argue, wanted to demand they turn around and search for the roadhouse, but he knew how that would sound. A driver babbling about a murderous establishment that nobody else had seen, that left no trace, that might not have existed at all. He'd be flagged for psychiatric evaluation and probably grounded until he could prove he was stable. So, instead, he asked Keir about the route, whether he'd seen any other buildings or structures in the area. Keir shook his head. This stretch is empty, always has been. There used to be a few old trapping cabins scattered around, but most of those collapsed years ago. What you sheltered in was probably one of the last standing. The words hit Orson like a physical blow. If there were no structures, if this area was as empty as Keir claimed, then where had he stopped? His memory was so clear. The sign, the access road, the warm interior of the roadhouse. It couldn't all have been hallucination, but the alternative was accepting that something impossible had happened. That a building could exist and then cease to exist. That Morna Quayle and her operation were something beyond normal criminal activity. Something that operated by rules Orson didn't understand. They reached the truck stop just as full darkness descended, though the distinction between day and night was minimal in the storm. The facility was modern and well-maintained, nothing like the rustic roadhouse Orson remembered. Bright fluorescent lights, clean floors, a proper restaurant with a visible kitchen and health inspection certificates on the wall. Real, solid, normal. Keir helped Orson inside and flagged down the on-duty manager explaining the situation. Within minutes, a medic from the camp infirmary was examining Orson, checking for frostbite and testing his cognitive function. The medic was thorough and professional, a woman in her 40s named Tamsin Rourke, who'd worked in Northern Emergency Services for years. She asked questions about Orson's experience, and he gave her the sanitized version. Caught in the storm, got disoriented, found shelter in an old cabin. She checked his fingers and toes, his nose and ears, looking for tissue damage. "You're lucky," she said finally. "Another hour and you'd have lost some digits at minimum. As it is, you'll be sore for a few days and need to watch for delayed symptoms, but you should make a full recovery." She gave him a list of warning signs to watch for and made him promise to see a doctor once he got back to Whitehorse. Orson showered in the truck stop facilities, the hot water painful against his cold, damaged skin, but necessary to fully restore his core temperature. Clean clothes from the truck stop's small store, a hot meal from the restaurant, and he was starting to feel almost human again. But the nagging questions remained. Where was his truck? What had happened to the hours between when he'd supposedly stopped at the roadhouse and when Keir had found him? And most importantly, how much of what he remembered was real? He found Keir at a table in the restaurant, working through a plate of eggs and toast. The older driver waved him over. "Feeling better?" Orson confirmed that he was and joined him, ordering coffee from the waitress. "I've been thinking about your situation," Keir continued. "Your truck is out there somewhere, and once this storm clears, we can organize a search. I've got some contacts with the local RCMP detachment. They can send up a helicopter, cover a lot of ground quickly. If your rig is where you think you left it, they'll find it." The mention of RCMP made Orson hesitate. If they found his truck near where he claimed the roadhouse had been, it would support his story. But if they didn't find it there, if it was miles away or in a completely different location, it would suggest his memory was unreliable. And unreliable memories meant psychological evaluation, possible suspension of his commercial license, the end of his career. Trucking was all he knew, all he was good at. Without it, he'd have nothing. But the alternative was letting Morna continue her operation, letting more drivers disappear, and he couldn't live with that either. "There's something else I need to tell you," Orson said, making his decision. He explained everything, the roadhouse with its welcoming owner, the odd details he'd noticed, the underground chamber full of stolen belongings, Morna's confession about facilitating deaths and collecting inventory, the chase through the storm, the frozen bodies. Keir listened without interrupting, his expression neutral, and when Orson finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Keir spoke. "I believe that you believe what you're saying, but you have to understand how it sounds. A roadhouse that nobody's ever seen, that apparently vanishes without trace, run by people who've been killing truckers for decades. That's not just criminal activity, that's something else entirely." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Hypothermia causes hallucinations. You said yourself you were disoriented. Is it possible that what you remember is a confused mix of real events and fever dreams? Maybe you stopped at an abandoned building, found some old belongings left by previous squatters, and your mind constructed a narrative around them." Orson wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Keir's explanation was reasonable, rational, much more plausible than his own account. Except for one detail. "My pack," Orson said. "I had a pack with my overnight gear. I took it into the roadhouse with me. Where is it now?" Keir acknowledged this was a good point, but offered an alternative explanation. "You might have dropped it while you were disoriented, or left it in whatever building you actually stopped at. When we search for your truck, we'll look for your belongings too. If we find them, that might help clarify what really happened." The conversation left Orson feeling frustrated and uncertain. Part of him appreciated Keir's skepticism. It was healthy, rational, exactly how Orson himself would have responded to such a story. But another part insisted that what he'd experienced was real, that Morna Quayle was out there right now, relocating her operation, preparing to trap more victims. The worst part was the doubt creeping into his own mind. The more time passed, the more the memories felt dreamlike, uncertain. Had Morna really looked the way he remembered? Had the underground chamber been as large as he thought? The details were starting to blur, and he found himself questioning his own perceptions. They spent the night at the truck stop. Orson sleeping fitfully in the driver's lounge, waking frequently from dreams where Morna's face loomed over him, asking why he'd destroyed her careful organization. Each time he woke, he was disoriented, unsure where he was or how much time had passed. The storm continued to rage outside, and through the windows he could see nothing but white. The world had been reduced to this small bubble of warmth and light, surrounded by an endless, frozen darkness that could hide anything. Morning brought a slight improvement in weather. The wind had died down and visibility had increased to maybe a quarter mile. Not great, but enough that a helicopter search was possible. Keir made calls to his RCMP contacts explaining the situation. Missing truck, driver found in distress, possible location known. Within 2 hours, a search and rescue helicopter was en route. Orson waited in the truck stop, watching the sky, trying to prepare himself for whatever they might find. Or not find. The helicopter arrived just before noon, a red and white rescue bird that landed in the truck stop's parking area. Rotor wash blasting snow in all directions. The pilot was a man in his 50s who introduced himself briefly before getting down to business. Orson described the location as best he could remember. The turnoff from the main road, the access road leading to the roadhouse, the approximate distance and direction. The pilot marked it on a map and confirmed they'd search that area first, then expand the search grid if necessary. Keir convinced the pilot to let Orson ride along, arguing that he'd be most likely to recognize the location from the air. They strapped in, the helicopter lifted off, and suddenly Orson was looking down at the landscape from above. The storm had left everything buried under fresh snow, transforming the terrain into an abstract pattern of white and gray trees reduced to dark lines, roads completely invisible. The pilot flew low, following Orson's directions, heading to where the roadhouse should have been. When they reached the area, Orson's heart sank. There was nothing there, no buildings, no sign of disturbance, just pristine snow covering undifferentiated wilderness. The pilot circled the area, flying search patterns, while Orson pressed his face against the window, desperate to see something that would validate his memory. He thought he saw the access road at one point, a subtle depression in the snow that might have been tire tracks or might have been natural contours. But there was definitely no roadhouse, no outbuildings, no evidence of human presence. They expanded the search, covering a 10-mile radius from the original location. And that's when they found Orson's truck. It was 6 miles from where he'd thought the roadhouse was, pulled off on the shoulder of the main highway, nearly buried in snow, but otherwise intact. The pilot landed nearby, and Orson climbed out, wading through waist-deep drifts to reach his rig. The doors were locked, exactly as he would have left them. Inside, everything was as he remembered. His logbook, his thermos, his personal items. Nothing was missing except his overnight pack. The pilot and Keir exchanged glances that Orson recognized. They thought he'd simply stopped here, grabbed his pack for some reason, wandered away from his truck in the storm, and gotten disoriented. A simple case of exposure and confusion, nothing mysterious or sinister. Orson wanted to argue, to insist that this wasn't where he'd stopped, but he couldn't. The evidence was clear. His truck was here, not 6 miles away at a non-existent roadhouse, which meant either his memory was completely unreliable, or something had moved his truck while he was at Morna's place. They searched the area around his truck, looking for his missing pack or any sign of where he'd gone. They found nothing. The fresh snow had covered everything, leaving no tracks, no clues. After an hour of searching, the pilot declared they needed to return before weather conditions deteriorated again. Orson climbed back into his truck, started the engine, which turned over after some protest, and followed Keir back to the truck stop, the helicopter escorting them from above. Back at the facility, Orson gave a formal statement to an RCMP officer who'd arrived while they were searching. He told the truth as he remembered it, and watched the officer's expression grow more skeptical with each detail. When he finished, the officer closed his notebook and suggested gently that Orson might want to speak with a counselor. Exposure can do strange things to perception and memory. What you experienced was traumatic, and it's normal for the mind to create narratives to make sense of traumatic experiences. But we need to deal with facts, and the facts are that your truck was where you left it. There's no evidence of another structure, and no one else has reported anything suspicious in that area. The officer left, and Orson sat alone in the restaurant, staring at coffee that had gone cold. Around him, other truckers came and went, living their normal lives, dealing with normal problems. Weather delays and mechanical issues and delivery schedules. Simple, comprehensible challenges. None of them were questioning whether their memories were real, or whether they'd narrowly escaped from a predator that didn't officially exist. Keir found him there an hour later and sat down across from him. "Look," Keir said carefully, "I know you believe what you told me, but you have to consider the possibility that your mind played tricks on you. It happens. The cold, the isolation, the fear, they can create very convincing false memories. What's important is that you're alive and safe. Your truck is fine. You didn't lose any cargo. In a few days, this will just be a scary story you tell other drivers." Orson nodded, accepting this because arguing seemed pointless. But he didn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. Something had happened to him out there, something that didn't fit the official explanation. His pack was still missing, and he had a clear memory of the taste of that stew, the warmth of the fire, the texture of the wooden walls under his hands. Those sensory details felt too real to be hallucination, but without evidence, without support, he was stuck with doubt. That evening, while preparing to sleep in his truck, Orson found something that made his blood freeze. Tucked into his logbook, where it definitely hadn't been before, was a small piece of paper. The writing on it was neat and precise, and it said simply, "You were never here. We were never here. But we'll see you again. MQ." Orson stared at the note, his hands shaking. Morna Quayle. It was proof. Proof that she existed, that the roadhouse existed, that everything he remembered was real. He ran to find Keir, clutching the note, ready to show him the evidence. But when he found the older driver and thrust the paper at him, Keir's expression was confused. "What am I looking at? This is blank." Orson looked down and saw that Keir was right. The paper was blank now, no writing visible. He could have sworn the message had been there seconds ago, but now it was gone, as if it had never existed, or as if it had only ever been visible to him. Keir's concern deepened. "Orson, I think you need to take some time off. Real time off, not just a day or two. Talk to someone. Process what happened to you." Orson nodded numbly and returned to his truck, the blank piece of paper clutched in his hand. He sat in his cab for a long time, staring at it, willing the writing to reappear. But it remained blank. Over the next 3 days, as the storm finally cleared and Orson prepared to resume his route, he found more evidence that appeared and disappeared. A driver's license in his glove compartment, belonging to someone named Ambrose Pike, dated 2003. When he tried to show it to the RCMP officer who returned to follow up, the license wasn't there anymore. A CB radio that appeared in his sleeper berth, an old model from the 80s. Gone by the time he could document it. Small items that would appear for minutes or hours, then vanish, like Morna was taunting him, proving that she could reach him anywhere, that he'd never truly escaped. The worst was the voice on his CB radio. Late at night, when he was alone in his truck, he'd hear her. Not speaking to him directly, but as if he was overhearing a conversation. Morna talking to Hale about inventory management, about moving to a new location, about the next guest who'd be arriving soon. Always speaking about truckers, about the work they did, about how useful their belongings would be. And then, occasionally, a direct message. "You should have stayed, Orson. The process is peaceful, better than spending your life wondering what was real." He tried recording the transmissions, but they never appeared on playback. Tried having other drivers listen, but they heard only static. The haunting was personal, directed solely at him, and he began to understand what Morna had meant about the food containing elements. She'd said it made people compliant, willing to accept their fate. But maybe it did more than that. Maybe it created a connection, a link that allowed her to reach into his mind even after he'd escaped physically. Orson continued driving, because stopping meant giving up his career and acknowledging that he was experiencing a mental breakdown. He took the jobs, met the schedules, maintained his truck with meticulous care. On the outside, he was a normal driver dealing with the aftermath of a close call with hypothermia. But on the inside, he was haunted by questions that had no answers, and evidence that existed only in his perceptions. He avoided that stretch of highway between Whitehorse and Dawson, taking longer routes that added hours to his trips. But he knew it was only a matter of time before he'd have to go back. Before he'd see that sign again, promising shelter and warmth and food. 6 weeks after the incident, Orson received a call from an RCMP detective named Thora Keene. She was investigating a series of missing trucker cases across the Yukon and wanted to ask him some questions. They met at a coffee shop in Whitehorse, and Orson told her everything, expecting the same skepticism he'd encountered before. But Detective Keene listened with a different quality of attention. When he finished, she pulled out a folder containing photographs and documents. "You're not the first driver to report something like this," she said. "Over the past 20 years, We've had 17 missing persons cases involving truckers on remote Yukon routes. Most were written off as weather-related deaths, bodies never recovered. But 3 drivers survived and reported experiences similar to yours. A roadhouse that appeared in storms, welcoming owners, food that tasted wrong, disappearing evidence. Each survivor was evaluated for psychological issues and their accounts were dismissed. But the pattern is there if you know to look for it. Orson felt validation wash over him like physical warmth. He wasn't crazy, wasn't hallucinating. Other people had experienced the same thing. "What happens now?" he asked. Detective Keene closed the folder and looked at him seriously. "Officially, nothing. There's no evidence that would justify a full investigation. No bodies, no witnesses who can provide consistent testimony, no physical location to search. But unofficially, I'm building a case. Documenting reports, looking for patterns, trying to figure out how this operation works. And I need survivors like you to help. Are you willing?" Orson agreed without hesitation. Over the following months, he became part of an informal network of drivers, law enforcement, and researchers trying to understand the phenomenon. They discovered that the roadhouse wasn't unique. Similar operations existed across Canada's remote north, in Alaska, in northern Russia. Always the same pattern. Appear during storms, offer shelter, trap victims, relocate before investigation. The operators moved with the seasons, following the harsh weather that created desperate drivers in need of help. They never caught Morna Quayle, if that was even her real name. Never found physical evidence of her operation, but they did start warning drivers, creating networks of communication, teaching people to recognize the signs of these predatory establishments. The missing persons cases dropped from 2 or 3 per year to 0, suggesting that awareness was the best defense. Whatever Morna was, criminal, something else, something that existed in the gaps between normal reality, she relied on victims who didn't know to be suspicious. Orson continued driving, but differently now. He carried extra supplies, never relied on finding shelter, always had backup plans. And he listened to his CB radio carefully, cataloging the strange transmissions, the voices that appeared during storms. Sometimes he heard Morna, frustrated about the lack of new inventory, complaining that drivers had become too cautious. Those transmissions gave him grim satisfaction. She was still out there, but she was hungry, starved of victims. Slowly being forced to shut down her operation or move to different hunting grounds. On the 1-year anniversary of his experience, Orson drove past the location where he believed the roadhouse had been. The road was clear, weather was perfect, and in the daylight he could see the landscape plainly. There was no access road, no sign, no indication that anything had ever been there. But as he passed mile marker 47, his CB crackled to life. "We're still here, Orson, still waiting, and eventually you'll stop being careful. You'll get caught in another storm, need shelter, and you'll see our sign. Because you're marked now. Part of our inventory whether we collected you or not. We'll see you again, maybe not this winter, maybe not next, but someday." It was Morna's voice, clear and certain, and then it was gone. Orson drove on, watching the road ahead, the white landscape stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The north was beautiful and deadly, and somewhere in its vast emptiness, Morna Quayle's roadhouse waited for its next victim. But not him. Never again him. He'd been marked, she was right about that. But the mark was a warning, a reminder to stay vigilant, to never trust apparent safety in the wilderness. The roadhouse was patient, could wait forever if necessary. But Orson could be patient too, and he would make sure that no other driver fell into her trap if he could help it. The highway stretched ahead, and behind him, lost in the distance, the hunting grounds of Morna Quayle remained empty. 3 years had passed since Orson Vale's encounter with Morna Quayle's roadhouse, and in that time he'd become something more than just a survivor. He was a documenter, a researcher, an unofficial expert on what he and others in their small network had come to call phantom establishments. The roadhouse was the most elaborate example they'd discovered, but it wasn't alone. There were ghost truck stops that appeared on highways during fog, phantom rest areas that offered coffee and vending machines before vanishing, even reports of entire towns that existed for a few hours before dissolving back into the landscape. All of them targeted travelers, particularly truckers, and all of them left behind the same pattern of missing persons and impossible stories. Orson had changed his entire approach to the profession. He no longer drove alone if he could avoid it, preferring to run in loose convoys with other drivers he trusted. He maintained contact via CB radio every 30 minutes when on remote routes, checking in with a network of dispatchers who understood the real dangers. His truck was equipped with multiple GPS tracking systems, dash cameras that recorded continuously, and a satellite phone that could reach emergency services from anywhere. He'd become paranoid, according to some. Prepared, according to others. Either way, he was alive. Detective Thora Keene had become his primary contact within law enforcement, though even she had to operate carefully. Her superiors didn't take the phantom establishment theory seriously, viewing it as folklore mixed with the genuine dangers of northern driving. But Keene had seen too many cases, too many patterns that defied conventional explanation. She'd built an unofficial database of incidents, cross-referencing missing persons reports with survivor testimonies and geographical data. The picture that emerged was disturbing. These operations had been running for decades, possibly centuries, adapting to each era while maintaining their core function of preying on vulnerable travelers. Winter came around again, bringing with it the familiar anxiety that now accompanied every storm forecast. Orson had learned to read weather patterns obsessively, planning routes that avoided the conditions most likely to spawn phantom establishments. Heavy snow combined with isolation seemed to be the key factors, creating circumstances where desperate drivers would accept any shelter without asking too many questions. But even with all his precautions, Orson knew that eventually his luck would run out. The north was too vast, storms too unpredictable, and human error too inevitable. Sooner or later, he'd find himself back in a situation where Morna's roadhouse, or something like it, would appear. The call came in early December, during a cold snap that had temperatures dropping to -40 across most of the Yukon. A mining operation north of Mayo needed emergency supplies, generator parts that couldn't wait for the scheduled convoy. The pay was exceptional, danger bonus included, and the company was offering to hire 2 trucks to split the load and provide mutual support. Orson took the job, and so did Keir Hollis, the driver who'd rescued him 3 years earlier. They'd stayed in contact, and Keir had gradually come to accept that Orson's experience might have been more than hallucination. He'd heard too many similar stories from other drivers, seen too many inconsistencies in the official explanations. They left Whitehorse together, 2 trucks running in tandem, maintaining visual contact and constant radio communication. The highway was clear initially, but weather forecasts predicted a major system moving in from the west. They had maybe 6 hours to reach the mine, deliver the supplies, and get back to civilization before the storm hit. It was tight, but manageable if everything went smoothly, which, as both drivers knew, was never a guarantee in the north. The first few hours passed without incident. They made good time, the roads were well maintained, and the temperatures stayed stable. They passed through Mayo, the last real town before the mining camp, and continued north on increasingly rough roads. This was backcountry even by Yukon standards, territory where cell phone coverage was non-existent, and the only traffic was mining vehicles. The landscape was breathtaking in its harshness. Endless white, punctuated by dark stands of spruce, mountains rising in the distance, a sky that threatened snow. They were about 40 miles from the mining camp when Kier's voice crackled over the CB. "Orson, you seeing this?" Ahead, the sky had darkened dramatically, clouds rolling in with unusual speed. The storm was arriving early, hours ahead of a forecast, and it was coming on fast. They had a decision to make: push forward to the mining camp or find shelter and wait it out. The camp was close enough that pushing forward seemed viable. But both drivers had learned to respect their instincts in the north, and right now, both their instincts were screaming danger. "Let's make for the camp," Orson said into his CB. "We stick together, keep our speed steady. If visibility drops too much, we pull over and wait." Kier acknowledged, and they continued forward, but the storm was closing faster than seemed natural. Within 10 minutes, visibility had dropped to less than 50 feet, and the wind was hitting their trucks with force that made maintaining a straight line difficult. The temperature was dropping too, the gauge on Orson's dashboard showing -43 and falling. That's when Orson saw the sign. It appeared on the right side of the road, a wooden post with hand-painted letters that read, "Northern Shelter Inn, 2 miles, 24-hour service, all welcome." His blood went cold. It was the same style as the roadhouse sign, the same too convenient appearance during a storm. He grabbed his CB immediately. "Kier, do you see that sign? The one advertising an inn?" There was a pause. Then Kier's voice came back, puzzled. "What sign? I don't see anything." Orson's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The sign was visible to him, but not to Kier, which meant either he was hallucinating or the establishment was specifically targeting him. Morna had said he was marked, part of her inventory whether collected or not. Was this her roadhouse under a different name? Or was this a different operation entirely, drawn to him because he'd already been exposed to the phenomenon? "Never mind," Orson said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Must have been a shadow. Let's keep moving." But as they continued forward, the storm intensified to impossible levels. The wind reached sustained speeds that should have been physically incapable, and the snow wasn't falling. It was moving horizontally, driven by forces that felt unnatural. Both trucks were being buffeted so violently that maintaining any speed was becoming suicidal. Kier's voice came over the radio, strained with effort. "Orson, I can't see you anymore. Where are you?" Orson checked his mirrors, but Kier's truck had vanished into the white. They'd been 20 yards apart, well within visual range even in heavy snow, but now there was nothing. "I'm right ahead of you," Orson transmitted, but he was getting only static in response. He tried his satellite phone, but it showed no signal, which should have been impossible with a satellite system. All his GPS units were showing errors, unable to acquire position. Every piece of technology he'd relied on was failing simultaneously, leaving him alone in a whiteout with no way to navigate or communicate. This was wrong. This was deliberately wrong. Something was separating him from Kier, isolating him, making him vulnerable. The sign appeared again, closer this time, and now Orson could see the access road it pointed to, a clear path through the storm, almost inviting. He knew he shouldn't take it, knew it was a trap, but he also knew he couldn't continue blindly forward in these conditions. His truck was already sliding on ice, the road beneath him becoming less predictable with each yard. And without being able to contact Kier or confirm his position, driving forward meant risking collision or driving off the road entirely. Orson made a decision that he knew he might regret. He took the turn onto the access road, but this time he was ready. He had his dash cameras running, recording everything. He had a handheld GPS device that he'd start manually tracking their path. And most importantly, he had knowledge. He knew what these places were, how they operated, and what to watch for. If this was Morna's Roadhouse or something similar, he wasn't going to be an easy victim. The access road was eerily clear compared to the main highway, the storm seeming to part around it. The further he drove, the calmer the conditions became, until he was moving through nearly still air with only light snow falling. Unnatural, impossible, but useful for maintaining control of his vehicle. After about a mile, buildings appeared ahead. Not just one structure like Morna's Roadhouse, but an entire small complex. A main lodge building, what looked like a garage or maintenance facility, a few smaller cabins, all lit warmly against the darkness. As Orson pulled into the parking area, he saw other vehicles. 3 trucks, 2 vans, a handful of pickups. All of them looked operational, not abandoned, which suggested other travelers had taken shelter here. Or suggested that the establishment wanted him to think there were other people. Orson parked his truck where he could leave quickly if needed, leaving his engine running despite the fuel cost. He sat for a moment, checking his equipment. Dash cameras still recording. Handheld GPS tracking his location. Knife on his belt. Satellite phone in his pocket, even though it wasn't working. He was as prepared as he could be. The door to the main lodge opened before he could reach it, and a man stepped out. He was in his 60s, heavy-set, with a friendly face and welcoming demeanor. Come in, come in. You picked a hell of a night to be on the road. Name's Hale Broder. I run this place. Get yourself inside before you freeze." The name hit Orson like a punch. Hale Broder had been the young helper at Morna's Roadhouse. But this man was 3 decades older, and he'd introduced himself as the owner, not an assistant. Same name, different role, wrong age. Nothing about this made sense. Orson followed him inside, his senses on high alert. The interior was similar to Morna's Roadhouse, but more elaborate. A large common room with multiple seating areas, a substantial bar along one wall, and a restaurant section with a dozen tables. And, unlike last time, there were actually other people here. Drivers sitting at tables, drinking coffee or eating meals, talking in low voices or reading. They looked real, solid, not like the flickering projections he'd half suspected they might be. "You're wondering if this is real," Hale said, his tone still friendly but with an edge of something else. "If we're real. If you're safe here or walking into another trap. Smart questions. You're the driver who escaped from Morna 3 years ago, aren't you?" "Orson Vale. We've been expecting you." The casual confirmation that they knew who he was, that they'd been waiting for him specifically, made Orson's blood run cold. "What is this place?" he asked, his hand moving toward his knife. Hale made a calming gesture. "Not what you think. We're not like Morna's operation. We're adjacent to it, but different. The phantom establishments, as you call them, they're not all the same. Some are predatory, like the Roadhouse. They trap and kill, but others exist for different reasons. This place, the Northern Shelter Inn, we're what you might call a refuge. A real one. We appear during storms not to trap drivers but to save them from the predatory establishments." Orson didn't lower his guard. "Then why did my communications fail? Why was I separated from my partner? Why did the storm force me here?" Hale nodded, as if these were excellent points. "Because we had to get you away from where you were heading. The mining camp you're trying to reach, it doesn't exist anymore. The company shut it down 3 weeks ago, but they never notified your dispatcher. Someone else sent you that pickup request. Someone who wanted you on that road in this storm. Morna's been hunting you specifically, Orson. She's been waiting for 3 years to get you back, and tonight she almost had you." The explanation was plausible but unverifiable, and Orson said so. Hale gestured to one of the other drivers in the common room. a woman in her 40s who looked exhausted but unharmed. Ask her, ask any of them. We saved them from the same trap you almost fell into. This inn exists because someone, a long time ago, decided that if there were going to be predatory establishments in the north, there needed to be refuges too. Places where drivers could actually be safe, where the rules of those other places don't apply. Orson approached the woman driver, who introduced herself as Tamsin Rourke. Different from the medic he'd met 3 years ago, but the name sent a chill through him anyway. She explained that she'd been hired for a fake delivery, got caught in an impossible storm, saw a sign for a roadhouse called Morna's Place, but then this inn had appeared and the owner had literally flagged her down, warning her not to stop at the other establishment. I thought he was crazy at first, she said. But then I saw the roadhouse up ahead, and I saw things moving around it that weren't human. Not really. And I knew he was telling the truth. Other drivers shared similar stories. All of them had been targeted by predatory establishments, and all had been redirected here by the inn's operators. The place existed as a kind of counter-operation, identifying potential victims and intervening when possible. But they couldn't save everyone. The phantom establishments were too numerous, too widespread, and too good at avoiding detection. We saved maybe 1 in 10, Hale admitted. The rest, they end up in places like Morna's Roadhouse, or worse. Orson wanted to believe this was genuine, that he'd finally found allies in his fight against the phantom establishments. But trust was hard after everything he'd experienced. How do I know this isn't just another trap, a more elaborate one? Hale's expression turned somber. You don't, you can't. That's the hell of what we're all living in, the inability to trust your own perceptions. But I can tell you this. In the morning, when the storm clears, you can leave. We won't stop you. We'll even help you find your partner Keir, who right now is sheltering in his truck about 5 miles back, completely safe but unable to move forward. And when you leave, you'll find that the mining camp really is shut down, just like I said. The promise that he could leave was reassuring, but Orson remained wary. He spent the evening in the common room, talking to other drivers, comparing stories, looking for inconsistencies that would reveal this as another trap. But everyone's accounts matched, their details consistent, their fear genuine. These were real people who'd really been saved from something terrible. Or they were a very convincing simulation designed to make him lower his guard. Late that night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, Orson found Hale sitting alone at the bar. The older man was going through paperwork, real paperwork, ledgers and receipts and supply orders. Can't sleep either? Hale asked, pouring 2 cups of coffee from a pot that was probably 6 hours old. Orson accepted one and sat down. Tell me the truth. What are these places really? The roadhouses, the inns, all of it. What are we dealing with? Hale was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal. The north is thin, he finally said. The barriers between what's real and what's other, they're thinner up here. Has been for as long as humans have been traveling these routes. Native peoples knew about it, had rules and protections. But when outsiders came, building highways and industrial operations, they didn't respect those boundaries. And things slipped through. Or maybe they were always here, and we just gave them new shapes to wear, new ways to hunt. He took a sip of his coffee before continuing. The predatory establishments like Morna's Place, I don't know how to explain it properly. They're not just criminals with unusual methods. They're something older, something that learned to mimic human hospitality to lure in prey. They take the form of roadhouses and truck stops because that's what travelers expect to find, what they're desperate to find. And the more people they consume, the stronger they become, and the more real they get. And places like this inn? Orson asked. Hale smiled sadly. We're the same thing, but with different intentions. Someone who knew about the predatory establishments decided to create a counter. A place that looks like what travelers need, but actually is what they need. We exist in the same strange space between real and unreal. The difference is what we do with that existence. We save instead of consuming. The explanation raised more questions than it answered, but Orson found himself believing it. Not because it made sense rationally, but because it matched his experiences over the past 3 years. The North was strange in ways that couldn't be explained by normal logic. Accepting that strangeness, learning to navigate it, was the only way to survive up here. So, what do I do? Orson asked. How do I protect myself and other drivers from the predatory places? Hale's answer was simple and frustrating. You stay aware, you trust your instincts. You never accept help that seems too convenient, and you never stop questioning what you see. The phantom establishments rely on desperation and gratitude to lower people's defenses. If you can maintain skepticism even when you're freezing to death, you have a chance. And you spread the word to other drivers. Build networks of knowledge. The more people who know these places exist, the weaker they become. They talked through the night, Hale sharing what he knew about different types of phantom establishments and their patterns. There were the predatory ones like Morna's Roadhouse, which trapped and killed. There were parasitic ones that didn't kill but weakened travelers, feeding on their vitality without quite consuming them entirely. There were even neutral ones that existed without clear purpose, liminal spaces that travelers could pass through safely if they didn't linger too long. The geography of the strange was more complex than Orson had imagined. Dawn came gradually, the storm outside beginning to abate. Hale kept his promise. As the light increased, he offered to help Orson locate Kier and continue their journey, but he also gave a warning. Morna knows you're here now. She knows we intercepted you. She'll be angry, and she'll be more determined to collect you. The marked never fully escape. You're always on her inventory list, always a target. You need to be even more careful from now on. Orson prepared to leave, checking his truck and equipment. Everything was as he'd left it, nothing stolen or tampered with. The other drivers were stirring, preparing for their own departures, and the scene was so utterly normal that it was surreal. As he climbed into his cab, Hale approached one last time. One more thing. Detective Keene, your contact in the RCMP. She knows more than she's told you. She's not just investigating these cases out of professional duty. She's been touched by the phantom establishments too, lost someone to them. When you talk to her next, ask her about her brother. She'll understand that you know. Orson drove away from the Northern Shelter Inn, following the directions Hale had given him to where Kier was sheltering. He found his partner exactly where predicted, truck running, driver safe, but confused about why Orson had disappeared. I lost sight of you in the storm and had to stop, Kier explained. Figured you'd either pushed through to the mine or found somewhere to wait it out. Where were you? Orson told him everything. The inn, Hale's explanations, the warning about Morna. Kier listened with the same skeptical attention he'd shown 3 years ago, but this time his skepticism was tempered with belief. He'd spent 3 years hearing stories from other drivers, had seen too many patterns to completely dismiss the phantom establishment theory. So, what now? He asked when Orson finished. Now we verify, Orson said. We drive to that mining camp and see if it really is shut down. If Hale was telling the truth about that, then maybe he was telling the truth about everything else. They continued north together. the storm having passed entirely, leaving clear skies and brutal cold. The mining camp appeared ahead, and they could see from a distance that it was indeed abandoned. The gates were locked, equipment stood idle, and a notice posted at the entrance confirmed that operations had ceased 3 weeks earlier due to mechanical failures and would not resume until spring. Keir swore quietly. Someone sent us up here knowing the camp was closed, knowing we'd be stranded in a storm with nowhere to go. Orson nodded, and knowing that I'd be desperate enough to take shelter at the first place that appeared. They searched the abandoned camp and found evidence that someone had been there recently. Fresh tire tracks, signs of entry into the main office. Someone had staged this whole scenario, using real company paperwork and legitimate-looking communications to create a trap. They reported everything to Detective Keene, who arrived with a forensics team 2 days later. The evidence was thorough: forged documents, hacked communication systems, a sophisticated operation designed to lure specific drivers into dangerous situations. But the people behind it remained ghosts. No fingerprints, no DNA, no digital trails that led anywhere useful. "It's like they don't exist," Keene said in frustration. "Or they exist in a way that doesn't leave evidence our systems can detect." Orson asked her about her brother, watching her expression carefully. Keene's face went still, then she nodded slowly. "How did you know about that?" Orson explained about Hale's comment, and Keene let out a long breath. "My brother disappeared 15 years ago. He was a trucker, ran routes through northern Saskatchewan. Last anyone heard from him, he was taking shelter from a blizzard at a place called Safe Haven Lodge. We never found the lodge, never found him. Eventually, the case went cold. That's why I'm obsessed with these disappearances. That's why I believe you when everyone else thinks you're crazy, because I know these places are real, even if I can't prove it." The revelation created a new bond between them. They were both survivors, both marked by encounters with the phantom establishments, both dedicated to protecting others from the same fate. Over the following months, they expanded their network, recruiting more law enforcement and drivers who understood the threat. They couldn't destroy the predatory establishments. Those seemed to be permanent features of the northern landscape. But they could reduce their victim count through education and awareness. Orson continued driving, but he was different now. He'd learned to navigate the strange geography of the north, to recognize the signs of phantom establishments, to trust his instincts even when they contradicted physical evidence. He'd seen the Northern Shelter Inn twice more in the years that followed, always during storms when he was most vulnerable, always offering genuine refuge. And he'd avoided Morna's roadhouse several more times, recognizing her traps before they could close around him. But he knew she was still out there, still hunting. Sometimes he'd hear her voice on his CB radio late at night, talking about inventory management and the one that got away. Sometimes he'd see her sign during storms, just visible at the edge of his headlights before he could change routes and avoid it. She was patient, as she'd said. She could wait forever if necessary. And he was marked, part of her collection whether physically present in her cold storage or not. 5 years after his first encounter, Orson was hauling freight through the Yukon in early winter when he saw something that made him pull over. There, by the side of the highway, was a driver standing next to a broken-down truck. A young man, maybe 25, looking cold and desperate. It was late afternoon, and storm clouds were building. This driver wouldn't survive the night without help, but Orson had learned to be suspicious of everything, especially coincidental encounters. He approached cautiously, keeping his distance. "You need help?" The young driver nodded eagerly. "Yeah, man. Alternator died. No power, no heat. I've been stuck here for 2 hours. Can you give me a ride to the next town?" It all seemed legitimate. The disabled truck, the desperate driver, the reasonable request. But Orson had learned that the phantom establishments could create elaborate scenarios. This could be genuine, or it could be Morna wearing a new face, using a new trap. Orson made a decision. I can't give you a ride, company policy, insurance reasons, but I can call for help, stay with you until it arrives, and make sure you're safe. He called Keene, gave their position, and requested emergency services. While they waited, he talked to the young driver, asking questions, looking for inconsistencies. The man's story checked out. His name was in the trucking company database. His route was legitimate. His breakdown was explainable. He seemed real. But as the sun set and the storm moved in, Orson saw lights in the distance. A building that hadn't been there before, windows glowing warmly. And he heard the young driver say, "Hey, look, there's a place up ahead. We could walk there, get warm while we wait for the tow truck." Orson grabbed his arm. "No, we stay with the trucks. That place, it's not safe." The young driver looked at him confused. "What do you mean? It's just a roadhouse." Orson spent the next hour explaining about phantom establishments while they waited in his cab, the heater running, the storm raging outside. The young driver thought he was crazy at first, but as Orson shared more stories, showed him the documentation from Keene's investigation, and pointed out the subtle wrongness of that building in the distance, doubt crept into the young man's expression. "So we just ignore it, even though we could freeze?" Orson nodded. "We ignore it, because freezing is better than what happens if we go in there." The tow truck arrived 2 hours later, and the young driver was safe. As they parted ways, the man thanked Orson and asked how he could learn more about these dangers. Orson gave him Keene's contact information and the websites where survivor networks shared information. One more driver educated. One more potential victim saved. It wasn't much against the vastness of what they faced, but it was something. Orson continued his route, watching the phantom roadhouse in his mirrors as he drove away. It flickered for a moment, showing its true nature, something hungry and ancient wearing the shape of hospitality. Then it was gone, dissolved back into the storm, waiting for the next desperate traveler who didn't know better than to accept its invitation. The highway stretched ahead, and Orson drove on through the northern night, marked but surviving, haunted but aware. Somewhere out there, Morna Quayle's roadhouse was relocating again, preparing new traps for new victims. And somewhere else, the Northern Shelter Inn was appearing to save someone who desperately needed saving. The battle between predator and refuge continued its eternal cycle across the frozen landscape. Orson was part of that cycle now, neither fully victim nor fully saved. He existed in the liminal space between, a driver who'd seen too much to ever feel safe, but knew too much to be easily trapped. The North had marked him, had shown him its hidden face, and he would spend the rest of his driving career navigating its strange geography. The CB radio crackled with Morna's voice one last time. "We're patient, Orson. So very patient. And winter comes around every year. We'll see you again." Orson didn't respond. He just drove on, watching for signs that appeared too conveniently, for buildings that promised shelter without earning trust, for the subtle wrongness that indicated he was approaching something that existed in the spaces between real and not real. The highway was long, and the winter was longer still, and somewhere in the white, Morna's roadhouse waited.